Yes. Order. Before we begin the debate, I wish to make a statement about the House's rule relating to matters sub judice. As the House will know, there are ongoing criminal cases involving the prosecution of British veterans who served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And while there are as yet no criminal cases arising from the Clonmel Inquest, the Government has initiated a judicial review of the Inquest's findings. Mr. Speaker has today granted a waiver to allow limited reference to active legal proceedings relating to historic Troubles-related deaths. Reference to these cases should be limited to the context and to the events which led to the cases, but not to the detail of the cases themselves, nor the names of those involved in them. Members should, as always, be mindful of the fact that these are properly matters for the courts and not for this House, and take special care to avoid saying anything that might interfere with the course of justice. Order. I call John Lamont to move the motion.
Mr. Mandel, it is a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 725716 relating to the protection of Northern Irish veterans from prosecution. As a member of the Petitions Committee, I am pleased to be fulfilling my duty in opening today's debate and presenting this petition, which has been signed by more than 170,000 people. I'd like to thank the petition creator, Ian Lyles, who joins us in the public gallery today. Ian spent 36 years in the Army, including 13 years in Northern Ireland. I know that members will thank him for his service and the service of all the veterans in the gallery today and who are watching across the country. The petition states that, and I quote, "We think that the government should not make any changes to legislation that would allow Northern Ireland veterans to be prosecuted for doing their duty in combating terrorism as part of Operation Banner." Mr. Mandel, the role that British soldiers play in keeping our country safe cannot be overstated. They put their lives on the line to defend our country, and they put themselves in harm's way to do so. But there is a shadow that hangs over our armed forces today, a political and legal attack that is targeting veterans of Northern Ireland who served under Operation Banner. In recent weeks, I have had the privilege of speaking with organisations and campaigners across communities in Northern Ireland. I've also heard from many of my own constituents in the Scottish borders who feel passionately about the need to protect our veterans from prosecution. I'd like to thank honourable and right honourable members across this House for their advice and guidance in preparing for today's debate. I pay tribute to the tireless campaigning from the Right Honourable Member for Goole in Pocklington, who raised this issue at Prime Minister's Questions last week, as well as the former Minister for Veterans in the last government, Johnny Mercer, for his work to protect and defend Northern Irish veterans during his time around the Cabinet table. Mr. Mandel, this Labour government has taken the decision to repeal the Legacy Act. That is a decision that I believe will shame our country for decades to come. Operation Banner took place between 1969 and 2007. It was a name given to the operations by British forces in Northern Ireland to stop IRA attacks. It spanned Labour and Conservative governments and 7 Prime Ministers. The previous Conservative government introduced the Legacy Act. It was designed to end the shameful spectacle of British veterans being dragged through the courts for actions taken decades ago when they were simply following the orders of the government of the day. I'll happily give way.
Military personnel have a term for passing the buck, sloping shoulders. I wonder if he is concerned that the measures we're discussing today, and with these measures, the state risks sloping shoulders onto the personnel who swore an oath of allegiance.
As think the honourable member makes an excellent point, and I'll go on to consider that a little bit more fully further on in my remarks. Mr Mandel, in 1998, as the then Prime Minister Tony Blair approached the end of his negotiations on the Good Friday Agreement, one final demand was made. Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness said they couldn't go ahead with the deal. They were fearful of community pushback and wanted to give terrorists amnesty from prosecution. So a deal was done. On-the-run letters were given to suspected IRA terrorists, telling them they were no longer wanted. It gave protection to terrorists. But nothing was offered to the soldiers who served in Northern Ireland. In the years that followed, we saw historical cases which were investigated at the time being re-examined. Veterans dragged to court on politically motivated charges. A witch hunt. That is why we needed the Legacy Act. The Secretary of State and this Labour government now want to repeal the protection afforded to soldiers as a result of this legislation. We are told that this will be achieved by removing parts of the Legacy Act via a remedial order, and then the government will then later introduce new primary legislation. The Prime Minister's own Northern Ireland Veterans SAR has said that it is immoral, two-tier justice, and would lead to vexatious lawfare against former soldiers. And it sets a dangerous historical precedent. Are we now saying that if the government today sent our troops into conflict, they could be held to account in years to come for following the instructions given to them by this government? If that is the case, why would anybody choose to serve our country? But that is the reality facing many of our Northern Irish veterans today. During my preparations for this debate, I spoke with one group who said the number of veterans who would be prosecuted should the Legacy Act be revoked would only be in the low single figures. But that number is still too many, and it fails to recognise the worry and anxiety that it will bring to our veterans, many who are in old age, and their families. Let me be clear, Mr Mandel. If soldiers went out with murderous intent, they should be held to account. The rule of law should apply to those soldiers as it applies to the rest of us. But as the petition creator told me, he knew of no soldier who went out deliberately to murder. It is also important to remember that during the Troubles, when someone was killed, it was investigated, sometimes 3 times, by the Director of Public Prosecutions, by the police and the Coroner's Court. Mr Mandel, I want to refer... yes, happily.
He's making a very, very powerful speech, and I'm grateful to him. I met a number of veterans in my constituency last week of the Northern Ireland Troubles, and they made the exact point that the honourable gentleman is making. They never went out in order to kill. They went out to defend British citizens. Isn't what's so particularly outrageous about the proposal is that it does suggest some sort of equivalence between the killers and those who were appointed to protect. And as he says, it will impose this terrible chilling effect on recruitment in our services.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. There is no equivalence between a terrorist, somebody who sets out in the morning with murderous intent, and a soldier who's defending democracy and defending our country. And sadly, what we seem to be wanting to create is some sort of equivalence, and that should not be allowed to happen. Mr Mandel, I want to refer to the case of Dennis Hutchings, a former member of the Life Guard Regiment. Dennis was a terminally ill 80-year-old veteran who was dragged to Northern Ireland during the pandemic in 2021. He died of COVID just 3 days into his court case. Dennis was hounded for several years, told he was cleared, then not, and then forced to fly to Belfast to stand trial. There was no new compelling evidence, and it was simply not in the public interest. It was a barbaric way to treat an elderly man who had served our country. His lawyer said the case contributed to his death, and it was likely he would not have died at that point if he had not been forced to go to Northern Ireland to stand trial over an incident that occurred in 1974. Now, it's all too easy for us in this place to sit here, look at the evidence, and try to justify why a trial is in the public interest. But it fails to recognise the instant life or death decisions these soldiers in Northern Ireland had to take every single day. It is a rewriting of history. Decades on, people sit and judge events in retrospect with little new evidence and come to conclusions entirely at odds with the legal investigations at the time. And the government cannot and must not lose sight of its moral responsibility and commitment to our veterans and the Armed Forces Covenant.
On that point, the honourable member give way.
I'll happily give way.
Can the honourable member confirm if the unlawful nature of the Legacy Act meant that investigations into the deaths of more than 200 Operation Banner soldiers were shut down against the wishes of soldiers' families?
John Lamont.
The honourable member makes an important point about the supposed unlawful nature of the Act. I do not accept it's unlawful. Yes, the court has said that, but it's up to this government to challenge that, to appeal. And the question is why they have dropped that appeal. But I think there's a winnable case to be made on behalf of the British nation to uphold that Legacy Act and defend our veterans, because by not doing so, you are letting our veterans down. I just want to finish this point, but I will take further interventions. As I was saying, the government must not lose sight of its moral responsibility and commitment to our veterans and the Armed Forces Covenant. That responsibility is just as important for veterans who served decades ago in Northern Ireland as it is for former and current service personnel who served in more recent conflicts. I'm going to give way to my honourable gentleman here, and I'll give way to the honourable lady.
When Jack Straw at the dispatch box brought in the human rights legislation, the 1998 bill, he made it clear in terms that Parliament was not under any obligation in any way to introduce a remedial order after a declaration of incompatibility by a court. There's no need to win another court case. Parliament is supreme. The Act stands.
I think my honourable friend makes an excellent point, highlights the grave concerns that many of us have about how the human rights legislation is being applied in ways which were not intended, and indeed undermines and attacks the sovereignty of this place. I'll give way to the honourable lady.
Way. So most who served in Northern Ireland did so with absolute honour, including many of my former colleagues, and it's precisely because of that record that they deserve a system based on truth, not blanket immunity that casts a shadow over everyone's service. So would the honourable member agree, therefore, that applying the rule of law equally is in the interest of both veterans and serving personnel?
The rule of law does absolutely need to be applied equally, and that's why I said earlier that those soldiers who are found to be setting out with the wrong intentions should be held to account. But there is no equivalence between the actions of a terrorist and the actions of the British soldiers acting to defend democracy and to defend all the communities in Northern Ireland. I want to go on just to talk a little bit more about what Northern Irish soldiers, or soldiers serving in Northern Ireland did to ensure that they were doing everything as was required. Soldiers serving in Northern Ireland followed the yellow card, the rules of engagement for when they could open fire, and it was approved at cabinet level. They were given orders by the government of the day, and they followed those orders. The government has said it wants to take out sections of the Northern Irish Legacy Act. Now, that decision will have two major ramifications. Firstly, it will remove key parts of the Legacy Act designed to protect Operation Banner veterans from endless pursuit in the courts. Now, that raises deep concern and anger for those who signed this petition and for many across this House, as well as organisations like the Royal British Legion, who have expressed their concerns about the impact that they will have on veterans. Secondly, it would permit Gerry Adams and former terrorists to sue the government, effectively the British taxpayers, for potentially hundreds of millions of pounds. Should the remedial order be endorsed by Parliament, it could result in a six-figure payout for Mr Adams, simply because his interim custody order was not considered by the Secretary of State, but rather a junior minister. That is simply outrageous. We have seen a lot of examples of two-tier justice since this Labour government came to power, but this may simply be the worst of all. Is the government really contemplating creating a system to drag Northern Irish veterans through the courts whilst potentially paying millions to terrorists? How do those on the government benches expect to go back to their constituencies and explain why they have just voted for the prosecution of veterans whilst allowing terrorists to sue the taxpayer. They know that is not right. Now, we should also be clear about the differences between actions of soldiers and terrorists. When terrorists get up in the morning, they go out with murderous intent to use violence to attack our democracy. Soldiers do not. They put themselves in harm's way to keep people safe and to protect our nation. The difference is the intent. Soldiers serving our country are not lawyers sat behind a desk, able to gather a team and spend days to decide whether to act or not. They are doing their job in high-pressure, dangerous environments and must take instant decisions to protect themselves. It is what we train them to do. Mr Mundell, the Legacy Act is by no means perfect, but it is better than the disgraceful spectacle of veterans being dragged through the courts. Doing so is not sustainable, legally or morally. The alternative is constant legal battles, civil claims that go on indefinitely, and the erosion of public trust in both justice and government. Veterans who served in Northern Ireland have been through thorough, extensive scrutiny already. What the government plans to do to the Legacy Act is undermining the peace process our veterans fought so hard to achieve. Yes.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I join him in paying tribute to our armed forces, and he's made some very good points in that regard. But in relation to that, does he not accept that the Act that he is defending and that the government is committed to repealing has been opposed by all major political parties in Northern Ireland? And is it not important that when paying tribute to our armed forces and protecting them, that it is a solution that has the consent of the people and politicians of Northern Ireland as well?
So the landscape in Northern Ireland in terms of the political reaction to the Legacy Act, I accept, is mixed. But it was the decision of this Parliament to enact the Legacy Act, and the reaction of veterans groups, many of whom are in the room here with us today, has been almost universal in its condemnation of the decision of this government to try and repeal key parts of that Act. So I'm in no doubt whose side I'm on when it comes to this, and it's the standing up with the veterans who fought so hard to achieve that peace and to defend our country. Now, today's debate is hugely important, and I'm pleased to see the Secretary of State here to listen to the concerns of the petitioner, and that of myself, and I'm sure many other colleagues. But we need answers from the Secretary of State, not least on when the remedial order will be debated and voted on, what other primary legislation does the government intend to bring forward, and what is the timescale for doing so? And lastly, will the government commit to ensuring that soldiers who were subject to reviews at the time will not be subject to further risk of prosecution under the government's new legislation? Mr Mundell, there are nearly 2 million veterans across our country. The sad truth is that many feel their service is no longer respected. The Prime Minister and the Secretary of State have spoken about the need to support our armed forces. If that is the case, surely this is a completely hypocritical decision to allow these prosecutions to even be contemplated. I'll happily give way.
Does my honourable friend agree with me? It's time that the hand-picked Attorney-General, Lord Hermer, from whom the Prime Minister is taking legal advice about repealing this Act, should be sacked, taking his unpatriotic views with him, and we all need to stand right by our veterans. Yeah.
Well, as ever, my right honourable friend makes an excellent point, and she's absolutely right. We should be with our veterans 100%, and that's what I am hopefully doing during the course of this speech. Mr Mundell, veterans are only demanding protection for following orders from High Command and from vexatious, politically charged lawsuits. The government's position is destroying morale within the armed forces and is deeply unjust to veterans. The government of the day, whatever government that may be, must have the backs of our armed soldiers. They are extraordinary men and women who keep us safe and who go on difficult missions in dangerous and challenging places. They must be backed from cradle to grave. They protected our society, our freedom and justice in Northern Ireland. Surely we owe them their own freedom in return.
They should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 725716 relating to the prosecution of Northern Ireland veterans, and I call Louise Jones.
I did speak to the Shadow Secretary on this side of the chamber as well. Many of us here would love to participate in the other debate, but we can't do so because you can't be in two debates at the one time, although some people try. I know I've tried in the past, it doesn't work. But I just say this, Mr Chairman, we would like, if at all possible, for those MPs from Northern Ireland to be able to at least have an intervention and maybe have a question in the other debate. I just seek some guidance from you, Mr Chairman, if you don't mind, please. I hate to put you in the spot, my apologies for doing so, but they're not just the Northern Ireland MPs, but there are others here who served would probably wish to do the same. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr Shannon, for that point of order and for highlighting the conflict between this debate and the matter to be considered in the House later. I have considerable discretion in who is called and when they are called, and I will seek to exercise that in the most effective way possible. I call Louise Jones to speak.
Thank you, Mr Mundell, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I would like to begin by acknowledging the outstanding service of the many British service personnel who worked so hard on an incredibly difficult operation to protect the communities of Northern Ireland. We should be in no doubt that they upheld British military ethics to the very highest standards, rigorously trained, operations carefully planned and professionally carried out. As a veteran myself, I was honoured to serve with other veterans of that conflict, albeit at a later time. And we must never forget the 722 of those veterans who paid the ultimate price and did not return. We must never forget their sacrifice, nor that of those who were injured. We must remember them and honour their service with pride. Yeah. The Northern Ireland Legacy Act is a prime example of how to get legislation very, very wrong. In 2014, as part of the Stormont House Agreement, the UK and Irish governments had agreed a way forward to deal with legacy investigations that crucially had broad support from victims, crucial here, victims and political parties. Instead, in 2020, the Conservative government decided to push on by itself in a completely different direction and introduce legislation that made false promises to veterans that could not be kept, introduced chaos to the system, and has immediately failed in the courts. It was a law forced through, I'm going to make some progress if I may and then come back. A law that was forced through to try and curry favour in a desperate attempt to save the dying administration of Boris Johnson. Amongst all the complicated arguments around how best to properly deal with the impact of the Troubles, there is one huge, incontrovertible fact which is ignored in the previous speech, but that no amount of clever talk or posturing can obscure. The Legacy Act, as it stands, gives immunity to terrorists. That is abhorrent. So just to address the point made there, the head of the PSNI has said that the letters that you refer grant no immunity. The only thing that grants immunity to former members of the IRA is the Northern Ireland Legacy Act as it stands. That is a simple, simple fact. If we want to protect veterans, and I know that everybody in this room does want to protect veterans, then we must remember those who were murdered in cold blood by terrorists. Those terrorists now sleep soundly in their beds, free from the threat of prosecution, the threat of justice, precisely because of the Northern Ireland Legacy Act. They were given this by a British government. Imagine, a British government gave terrorists who have murdered British personnel complete immunity. Take the family of Tony Harrison, who I know there was an article today in The Guardian about the family of Tony Harrison, a British para who was murdered in East Belfast. He was shot whilst at home with his fiancée. He was not on military operations. This was not a firefight. He was shot in the back in his own home. He was just 21 years old. Under the Northern Ireland Legacy Act as it stands, there is no route for his murderers to be held to account. No wonder his family have now launched a legal challenge to the Act because they refuse to have Tony be denied justice. And we must never, ever forget, and always remember those 200 personnel whose families are being denied that justice because of this Act and how it stands. This is fundamental to why this Legacy Act must be repealed and replaced. Yeah.
She's made a very eloquent case for how defective the legislation was. Why did the government, when it was in opposition, not oppose sections 46 and 47? Does she think that they were wrong not to oppose it? Does she think that legislation was faulty? She evidently does, in which case, why didn't her own party, why did they support it?
I think this is a bit of a moot question when we are literally sat here debating to repeal the Act. You know, you're asking me if we opposed it in a parliament before I got elected here. I'm literally stood right here making the case to repeal parts of this Act and replace it.
Ms Jones continues, please.
This is fundamental to why this Legacy Act must be repealed and replaced. I say to anybody who has signed this petition, or indeed come here today, and that have signed it because they fear the raking over of every firefight, every weapon discharge, every contact from 50 years ago, that fear is false. I say again, it is scaremongering. It is complete scaremongering spread by people who are at best naive, perhaps don't know the details of the legislation, perhaps ill-informed as to the content. Yeah, give away.
I've just been outside with a load of veterans who served on our banner like myself. Are you saying that they're naive and misunderstood on this?
Louise Jones.
I've said, and you can read back, that people have been scared and had scaremongering spread by people who should know better, who know fully the details of the legislation, fully the context of Northern Ireland, who have gone out to these veterans and said, oh, there's going to be lots of malicious lawfare against you if this Act is repealed, when everybody here knows that is not the case at all. Instead, they are pushing a cynical political agenda. I and my other colleagues who are veterans are vehemently opposed to the spurious prosecution of dragging people through the courts where there is absolutely no case to answer of malicious lawfare. Cannot repeat this enough. I do not want to see a single veteran being hounded that has not committed a crime in any sense. Op Banner was an incredibly complex campaign. The idea that any veteran should be at risk of malicious lawfare simply for doing their job on a very difficult operation is something I find abhorrent. And I call on the Minister in his remarks to explain how we will protect any veteran that is accused of any wrongdoing in Northern Ireland. There is also... Yeah.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. Surely she's come to the crux of the point, which is no Minister has so far been able to give us that reassurance, and the Honourable Lady, sincerely stating her desire not to see veterans subject to that lawfare, have not had that reassurance. And whatever the inadequacies of the current legislation, it provides protections, and we have no reassurance that they will not be removed.
Louise Jones.
All I've heard is a very strong defence of the Act as it currently stands. I more than welcome a discussion about how we can move forwards and repeal what several members have already said are the inadequacies in the current Act. And I think that's a really key point. There are inadequacies in the current Act. I'm just going to make a little bit of progress, if I may, and then I will let you talk. There is a hard truth to acknowledge here, and others have already done so and no doubt will do so, that a very small number of military colleagues did commit a crime. It's a very, very small number, but nonetheless, it is a central belief of mine that it does not matter who you are, what you do, but that you should be held accountable if you commit a crime without fear nor favour. That is a hard truth. I know that every single person here who is a veteran would say that any person who has been a member of the military who has committed a crime should be held to account. I will give way to the lady if she would like to jump in. Honourable Member for Tiverton, where it is.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. This is a deeply sensitive debate. Two of my brothers served as officers in Northern Ireland, and the memory of Operation Banner has been raised time and time again by many of my constituents. The truth is that many of the soldiers in Northern Ireland were young lads from working class communities sent by their government and deployed to areas not dissimilar to those they had grown up in. They found themselves operating in some of the most stressful scenarios imaginable. Having had a meeting with the Minister for Veterans an hour ago, would the Honourable Lady agree with me and him that we must focus on the orders that were given higher up the chain of command rather than pursuing non-commissioned veterans in their old age? And would she also agree with me that there is a desperate need for reform to ensure that avenues to justice for bereaved families are reopened, but also to ensure that all armed forces personnel are treated with dignity and the understanding of the complexities of their experiences.
The Honourable Lady is making important points, but interventions must be short. Louise Jones.
I do agree with the Honourable Lady, and I say this as a former officer, and one thing that was really drummed into us at Sandhurst is the responsibility we have for those that serve under us. It is often the lot of those of lower ranks who will have to make the most difficult of decisions. And the responsibility is on officers to make sure that when soldiers go into a difficult situation, that they have the training and the cover that they need, and that officers are rightly held to account for any role that they play. And it's definitely something that I'll be keeping a close eye on, I can tell you. Right, so I say, as a proud veteran of the British Army, that we do ourselves a huge disservice if we do not hold ourselves to the highest standards and assure accountability when or if a comrade has failed those tests. Okay.
I'm very grateful to the...
in any event.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I'm very thankful for her service. She hasn't yet mentioned the 1998 Northern Ireland Sentences Act, which precludes anybody who has been found guilty even of murder from serving more than 2 years in jail, whether they are a veteran or whether they are a terrorist. So does she accept that a degree of equality has crept in and a degree of compromise has crept in? And will she bear that in mind when she talks about accountability for terrible crimes?
Point. And I think it's important to note that there's only been one soldier convicted in the past 13 years, and I don't have time to go into the details of that case, but I would urge the Honourable Member and anybody present to look into the details of that case and make the argument, if they will, whether or not a prosecution was in the public interest there. And I would note that he only served a suspended sentence. To sum up, this Legacy Act is unlawful. It's been found to be unlawful. It gives immunity to terrorists. So any more should be said. It gives immunity to terrorists, and it denies justice to the families of the 200 service personnel that were murdered by terrorists during the Troubles. It is not supported in its current form by victims. It's not supported by a Northern Irish party, and many veterans are troubled by it. It must go and be replaced, and again I call on the Minister to outline how we can protect veterans from malicious lawfare of any conflict. No, I really must finish, I think. I would like to end finally by remembering all the victims of the conflict in Northern Ireland. Far too many innocent lives were lost and families changed forever. The peace process and Good Friday Agreement stand testament to the immense courage every day shown by communities in Northern Ireland, communities who every day choose peace. We have a huge duty here in Westminster to work with those communities, not against them, and I hope everyone here will reflect on that important undertaking.
Sir David Davis.
Today we speak on behalf of our veterans and the 176,000 members of the public who have so far signed the petition to give those veterans protection against the vexatious legal pursuit of our brave heroes. Last week when I raised this in the House, the Prime Minister dismissed it as political point scoring. He's wrong. It's a matter of justice, a matter of ensuring that those who risk their lives to protect our citizens during the Troubles know the state stands behind them. And the Veterans Commissioners for Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, not naive people, issued a joint statement last week. They said, and I quote, "Inconsistent application of justice, particularly where it revisits incidents already thoroughly investigated, serves only to re-traumatize veterans and undermine public confidence." I agree with it entirely. It's exactly consistent with every veteran I have spoken to, and there have been a rather large number since February when I first raised this matter. But getting this right is not just a matter of historical justice. The legal witch hunt won't end in Northern Ireland. It'll cast a shadow over every future conflict that our armed forces engage in. and undermine their abilities to defend us. Now, I am a strong advocate of human rights. Many here who know me, I think the only person in the House has defeated governments from both sides, both in the House and in court, on matters of human rights. So I take them extremely seriously. But this issue is driven more by politics than by human rights, by the exigencies of politics than human rights. And take the inquiry process that I think both members, the member intervened earlier and the Honourable Lady, referred to. I imagine, and as the Minister will tell us later, the Secretary of State will tell us later, I imagine that by reinstating the inquiry process, the government believes it's dealing with the implied Article 2 right to investigate purportedly unlawful killings. I imagine that's what they're trying to do. And indeed, The Guardian this morning, and as we've heard referred again, the Secretary of State was claiming it was protecting the right to investigate 202 murders of British Army soldiers. Really? I wonder if along with that goes an undertaking to give witness statements by 200 terrorists who did those murders, who, incidentally, I say to the Honourable Lady, were given pardons in the part of the peace process by Tony Blair some 40 years ago. You know? 423, I think, were released from prison with pardons, and approximately 200 so-called on-the-runs comfort letters. That's not this Act, that's then, and it exists now and continues to exist now. Now, to continue to quote the Veterans Commissioners, there can be no moral equivalence between those who served in uniform to uphold peace and the rule of law and those who sought to destroy it through acts of terrorism. Again, I couldn't agree more. The largest group of people killed in the Troubles by a vast margin were those murdered by paramilitaries, to use the current euphemism for terrorists, killed by terrorists. Of those 2,000 people, every one was a murder. An unlawful killing, to use the phrasing in the coroner's courts these days. An unlawful killing, every one. We don't need a court to establish that. And the number of those IRA murders that will be subject to inquiry on the current listing, we've got 33 listed, 2 out of 2,000. This is because the major driver for those inquiries is the IRA Sinn Féin efforts to hide their own barbaric acts behind a freedom-fighting facade, trying to rewrite history, with them as heroes and the British state as villains. That's why battles like Coke, Clono, and very likely soon Loughgall feature so large in demands for inquiries, and the prosecution of long-retired, innocent British soldiers. All 3 of those actions were humiliating defeats for the IRA. But be clear, all of the IRA members who died in those exchanges, so-called victims in this context, were actively in the process of committing atrocities. They were trying to murder innocent people. At Coke, they planned to murder an off-duty UDR officer. At Clono, they attacked the Coal Island police station with an armour-piercing machine gun, attempting to murder police officers inside. At Loughgall, they drove a bomb-laden digger to blow up a police station, and they were armed and ready to murder any survivors. All were armed, all were dangerous, all were intent on murder. And many of them had killed before, making them a fatal risk to our soldiers, a risk our soldiers had to cope with in split-second decisions. These are the people we're going to put on trial if we allow them to lose their protection that we ought to be giving them today. And look at the individuals in them. Starting with Coke, the inquest heard about Michael Ryan. Ryan was probably responsible for many, many murders. I can cite 2. He shot 2 UDR officers, one in front of little children on a crossing, and the other one in front of his 13-year-old son. That's the sort of people we're dealing with. And as for the IRA's greatest defeat, Loughgall, the weapons recovered at the scene had been used in over 40 previous murders. There's no doubt about that. 40 previous murders. And of the IRA members there, McKerney and Arthurs were both involved in the Ballygawley police station attack, which murdered a further 2 policemen. James Linar, who was nicknamed the executioner by the RUC, was believed to be involved in over 30 killings. 30 killings. including the cold-blooded assassination of an 80-year-old, largely blind and deaf, Sir Norman Strong, with along with his son in front of him. And as for Patrick Kelly, who was the leader of that attack, he led the self-styled East Tyrone Brigade, believed to have killed around 250 people before Loughgall. He also, by the way, took part in a second attempt to assassinate a brave UDR officer, Glenn Espy, who's sitting behind me here in the gallery, who fought off the assassins on 2 occasions, was shot twice, and fought off IRA assassins twice. If they had not been stopped, all of these killers, if they had not been stopped, there is no doubt that those men would have continued their psychopathic campaign of murder. The IRA's campaign of violence was indiscriminate and extended far beyond the island of Ireland. And in the course of defending innocent civilians from those murders, it's not 722 if you include, I say to the Honourable Lady, it's not 722 if you include the policemen involved and the UDR officers involved, it's 1,073 servants of the British state who were killed. This psychopathic behaviour is what the IRA is trying to equate the British government's actions with. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to equate the two. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. There's ample evidence of the army taking enormous risks to arrest rather than a safer option sometimes of killing the terrorists. Consider the arrest, not the killing of the Armagh sniper who killed 7 people, but he was arrested, not killed. The killers of the killers of Captain Westmacott, arrested, not killed by the rest of his patrol. Even in today's Daily Mail, the rescue of Bernadette Macaliski, who was there was an attempt to kill her by the UDA. British soldiers rescued her, even though she was effectively the political arm of the INLA. The clearest demonstration of our real strategy is that whilst 1,073 British forces and soldiers and policemen were killed by Republican terrorists up until 1994, 145 paramilitaries were killed in the same period, compared with 428 taken prisoner. So 3 or 4 taken prisoner for every 1 killed. And by the way, 7 British soldiers or policemen died for every IRA person who was killed. That tells you the strategy. That tells you what the IRA are trying to reverse. Of course.
Did you not, therefore, I want to serve to marvel at the remarkable restraint shown by British soldiers, no matter whether they were officers or people from wherever across the UK, in dealing with this and never once stepping over the mark in the regard to these cases?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, the phrase I would use is heroic restraint, because restraint under those circumstances is putting your own life on the line and the life of all your comrades. That's what's going on there. That's the decision that's being taken, that's being challenged today. And so that's right. He's right about that. He's absolutely right about that. And of course, it was institutional. It wasn't simply heroic soldiers, or of course it was that. The yellow card system demanded restraint, warnings and proportionality. Every time a British soldier killed a paramilitary, it was subject to rigorous judicial scrutiny. And when that process failed, we ensured the matter was properly investigated. Remember the Savile inquiry? Yeah. £200 million, 12 years, 5,000 pages. What other country in the world would review its own behaviour in that way? I'm not going to actually cite all the options, but just think in your own minds. Some of our allies who would perhaps not have gone quite that far to give everybody justice. Our soldiers have been held to the highest standards of law. And yet our government is rewarding this by effectively threatening them in their retirement. And that's not a proper reflection. And remember, we've been talking about human rights. That is not a proper reflection of their human rights, because they are human beings too. They have human rights. So we should remind ourselves that human rights are founded in natural justice. They don't spring out the air. They're founded in natural justice. In this process, there is no natural justice for our brave veterans, nor, frankly, for the real innocent victims of the Troubles. This process doesn't give either of those. Now, the government is understandably, and the Secretary of State knows I have some sympathy for his position in this, is struggling to find a solution to this. Let me tell him the criterion for success, because it's very simple. It must completely remove the threat of prosecution from our brave veterans who have served their country well, who have already been through a process of judicial review of every action they took. If the government repeals the Legacy Act without a robust replacement, and that's the key point really here today, a robust replacement, if it replaces it without a robust replacement, we hand the narrative back to those who seek to rewrite history. Now, I accept that mistakes were sometimes made, and when they were, those responsible must be held to account, and that has been done. But we must not allow politically motivated lawfare to dismantle the very capabilities that make our armed forces precise, lawful, effective, and amongst the best in the world. What young person today would sign up to serve knowing that their reward could be a courtroom in retirement?
May I intervene?
I'll give way, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
What young person today? No, I will not. No, sorry. What young person today would sign up to serve knowing their reward would be a courtroom in retirement? It's through our soldiers' measured actions that the IRA's barbaric campaign of terror was confronted and diminished. The number of people killed by the IRA fell by 94% between the periods of 1970-74 and 1994-98. 94%. That outcome matters. Their intervention prevented countless more deaths. I've called on the government now 6 times to end this campaign of retrospective parody of justice, but have received so far no meaningful answer. And I hope we get one today. But I'll finish by saying this, Mr. Chairman. Today we talk a lot about human rights. In the adjournment debate, I read a poem I first heard at a Remembrance Day service, a regimental Remembrance Day service. And I'll read it again today because I think it's extraordinarily relevant. And I quote, "It's the soldier, not the reporter, who has given us the freedom of the press. It's the soldier, not the poet, who has given us the freedom of speech. It's the soldier, not the peace camp organizer, who has given us the freedom to demonstrate. It's the soldier who serves beneath the flag, whose coffin is draped by the flag, who allows the protester to burn the flag. It's the soldier, not the politician, who has given these freedoms." Those who freely talk about human rights would do well to remember that our rights, our law, our democracy, our nation were protected by the very veterans who are at risk today. So let us all make one promise, that no British soldier will ever again be abandoned by the very nation they have so bravely protected.
We don't have clapping within the House of Commons, so please restrain. I've allowed substantial contributions to allow the debate to get underway, but we will now have to move to contributions of around 5 minutes, and I call Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Mr. Mundell, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Like many other members in the debate today, I was proud to serve my country, and in my case, that was in 2006 with the Royal Marines when I deployed to Afghanistan shortly after basic training. I was a very young and green Marine, and was quite unexpected to go into a hostile and unexpected and unknown environment, like many colleagues I can see in the gallery that may have done something similar several years before. And in our preparation, we did all we would normally expect to do as a young Marine or soldier. We practiced troop attacks, we practiced battle casualty evacuations, we practiced mine clearances and everything else we might do on the battlefield. But you also spent a long time studying the law of armed conflict and studying the rules of engagement. Now, I know the people that we were fighting against in Afghanistan, the Taliban, they had no qualms about the rules of engagement or the law of armed conflict. And back in the generation before me, my colleagues, they were fighting an enemy then, the IRA, and others that had no qualms about the rules of engagement or the law of armed conflict. So it must have been terrifying to go into that situation. But I'm proud to say that, as with my generation, there were many hundreds and thousands of people that served on Op Banner with distinction, with bravery, and with real integrity. However, those groups, such as the IRA, such as the UVF, such as these other terrorist paramilitaries that we've heard about, under this Legacy Act, under the Legacy Act put forward by the last government, have been given immunity. I don't believe it is acceptable that people that have committed crimes, that have been involved in the killing of thousands of civilians and veterans on our side of the table, should be given such immunity. And I think it is unacceptable for us. We cannot let stand such an unlawful and unacceptable act that we've seen today. My granddad is from Belfast, and when I was in the city earlier this year, I was honoured to meet survivors of the Troubles at the Wave Trauma Centre. We met with people who had been targeted or caught up in collateral damage by Republican terror attacks. Victims whose only crime was to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They deserve the right to seek justice and the opportunity to receive answers. One was Maria Cahill. Maria was the target of years of sexual abuse at the hands of the IRA. This is what she said about the Conservatives' Legacy Act. This bill is quite simply disgraceful. Governments say they take sexual violence seriously, yet they are prepared to grant amnesty to those accused of conflict-related sexual offences in Northern Ireland and England. It is an affront to victims, to justice, and it is a gross hypocrisy. She, of course, is completely right. And the Legacy Act has given immunity to those who targeted servicemen and women. Families of the Hyde Park and Regent's Park bombings, where 11 British soldiers were killed by the IRA, were unhappy. One family member said, "People deserve justice, and their hurt will never heal until that happens." The challenge is the Legacy Act has created a moral equivalence. I agree with the member opposite. It has created a moral equivalence. Those who have committed crimes, those terrorists, are given the same immunities as those who bravely served in our armed forces. And as well as failing the test of victims, the Legacy Act has also failed the legal test. The Belfast High Court found the Legacy Act unlawful. After a challenge from Martine Dillon, whose husband was killed in 1997, the court found the immunity offered to members of the Loyalist Volunteer Force was in breach of her human rights. And of course it was in breach of her human rights. She deserves to get the justice and the answers that she pursues. The Conservatives' Legacy Act has allowed blanket amnesty to terrorists and perpetrators of offences, including murder and torture. The terrorists responsible for 90% of Troubles-related deaths have been given a free pass. This is a travesty of justice. The government has no choice but to amend the Act. Yes, I will give it. Oh, sorry, you weren't asking to give way. Yes.
To coming in on my honourable friend there, is the government going to reopen all of those cases?
So I think it's important, and we'll hear from the Minister later on, some of the protections afforded to veterans. But I think it's also very important to notice that in the last 13 years, there was only one veteran who's been prosecuted. And he, as we've heard from my colleague, received a suspended sentence. So the chance of any veterans who served in Northern Ireland being pulled over these coals again, being sent to prison, is vanishingly small. And we need to be realistic about that. We need to be honest with those people that signed the permission, that signed the petitions. Yes, yes, please.
He says it's vanishingly small, yet the Clono inquest found four unlawful killings, which implies there'll be 4 cases that go to the DPP.
I would like to hear more about the protections that veterans will be given from the Minister. One of which I understand is that no veteran will be asked to travel to Northern Ireland and they can give evidence remotely, which I think is important. But there does need to be more on protections. But let me finish. It's not acceptable to be in a position where we have an unlawful act that has been rejected by victims, that has been rejected by families of veterans, and has been found unlawful as well as being unacceptable to many members of the parties in Northern Ireland. Yes.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. I just want to make one thing very clear. The vexatious pursuit of veterans is the key here. Some never made it finally into the court, but they were pursued. Some died before they got to the court. It's not a good comparison to say only one was actually found guilty when so many have been pursued vexatiously from start to finish. And I don't know whether he understands how that feels when you are pursued, having to go to Northern Ireland, having to come back, being arrested by the police, then taken away. That is what is wrong with the existing legislation prior to this.
Thank you. I thank the member for his intervention. Yeah, he is right. The nub of the matter is to ensure that veterans have the right protections and that they are not taken through additional tests. But I believe the legislation that we have to change because it was unlawful, that we have no choice because it's let down victims. I believe the new legislation that we're putting in place will have deep cooperation with the MOD, and I notice that the Veterans Minister is here sitting alongside to ensure that every protection available within the law will be provided to veterans. And I'm sure some of that will be outlined during his response. I think I'm going to end my speech here because I've come over 5 minutes. But thank you. I think I've made my point.
Gavin Robinson.
Mr. Mundell, and can I thank you for your chairmanship and the opportunity to speak in this important debate. Can I start by giving thanks for the armed forces of our country? Can I start by giving thanks for those who came and served with us in Northern Ireland? People from Culloden coming to Coleraine, people from Folkestone to Fermanagh, people from Birmingham to Belfast, people from London to Londonderry. And they joined with us in defence of peace and in defence of the values of our nation. And there have been a number of figures that have been shared this afternoon in this debate already. 1,441 armed forces personnel died in Northern Ireland during Operation Banner. Not 722, not 1,043, 1,441. And they did so in support of the Royal Ulster Constabulary GC, 302 of which were murdered by terrorists in Northern Ireland. And it is right, and you will hear it in this debate, that every party in Northern Ireland opposed this Legacy Act. But can I remind you, for incredibly different reasons. I do not share Sinn Féin's opposition because I do not defend the IRA. And I do not defend those who decided to destroy or attempt to destroy our part of this United Kingdom. And I and my colleagues spend time in this House asking for our UK government to protect those who protected us. And so when I hear naive platitudes about the Legacy Act simply offering an amnesty to soldiers, I have to say this. It was the Labour government, following the Belfast Agreement, that released 435 prisoners from the Maze prison. That includes releasing Patrick McGee, who was responsible for blowing up the Brighton Hotel, for killing a member of our House, Sir Anthony Berry, for injuring Norman Tebbit and his wife. And a week after his death, can we not reflect that heinous men like Patrick McGee should not be released from prison? Or others, Sean Kelly, an IRA bomber, a brave man who believed in Republican ideals, walked into a fish and chip shop on a Saturday and blew up 9 innocent people, families, on the Shankill Road, and he was released by the Labour government. And after that, Republicans didn't stop in their pursuit. They asked the Labour government to encourage their comrades to come home. People who had been engaged in terrorism for years and evaded justice for years, who hid in the Irish Republic and weren't extradited because the Irish Republic said they couldn't get a fair trial in this United Kingdom. Or they fled to the United States, and individuals like Gabriel Magaki, who was the officer commanding of the IRA during the 80s and 90s in the United States of America, who was imprisoned by the FBI for trying to purchase SAM missiles to support the IRA in destroying our country. And didn't he get a grubby deal with President Clinton? And hasn't he been allowed to stay in the United States until President Trump is going to deport him? But it was the Labour government that introduced the Northern Ireland Offences Bill in 2003. It was the Labour government that asked this Parliament to agree a process to allow the on-the-runs to come back to this United Kingdom to retire with dignity. And thank God they had the resolve to withdraw that pernicious piece of legislation. But what did they then do? They engaged in a process of signing on-the-runs letters. And you'll hear people say they weren't in amnesty. Tell that to the families of the 4 members of the Household Cavalry that were murdered in the Hyde Park bomb, the 7 horses that were put down as a result of the Hyde Park bomb, or the 50 others who were injured in the Hyde Park bomb. Because when John Downey was taken to the High Court in London, he produced his letter. A secret scheme by the Labour government to allow him to walk out of court with no justice for his victims. And that's not all. Royal prerogatives of mercies from both sides of this chamber, Conservative government and Labour government, 365 royal prerogatives of mercies offered in Northern Ireland to give an amnesty to terrorists. And yet throughout all of that time, prisoner releases on the runs, the offences, Northern Ireland Offences Bill of 2003, or royal prerogative of mercies. How many were given to those who defended rule of law and order? None. And so let's be very clear about the danger of going down a line of allowing inquests to recommence. The Clonoe inquest is a classic example of how a judge goes beyond the terms of his brief. An inquest is to determine who died, where they died, when they died, and how they died, but not why, Mr. Mundell. A coroner's court is not there to determine if there's criminal liability, yet that is exactly what the judge did. A judge who in his judgment makes no reference to the context, no reference to who was killed that day, no reference to the terrorist campaign of the East Tyrone Brigade that was the bloodiest of them all. No reference. And yet the very same coroner could do so when he did the Coke inquest a number of months before. And why do they pursue these inquests, which the Secretary of State seems keen to recommence? Because those lawyers who do wish to rewrite history in Northern Ireland are laying the foundations for prosecutions. The reason why closing down those inquests was important, Mr. Mundell, was that it stopped this pernicious ability to put the building blocks in place to see our veterans in court. And yet the Secretary of State met with Mairead Kelly, sister of Patrick Kelly, the OC of the East Tyrone Brigade of the IRA, on the 24th of March of this year. And Dara Mackin, solicitor from Phoenix Law, put out a statement immediately after, salivating that he had got a commitment from our Secretary of State for Northern Ireland that inquests would recommence. Their sights are on Loughgall. Their sights are on building a pernicious and never-ending pursuit against those who served in Northern Ireland. And our responsibility as parliamentarians from across this United Kingdom is to say no. We will not assist your quest to rewrite the history of the past, nor will we assist in the IRA's pursuit to try and attain some level of honour toward their retirement. They tried to destroy this country through war, and they failed. Let's not create the conditions for them to try and destroy the reputation of this country through peace.
Let's refrain from the applause. Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it's an honour to serve under your chairmanship. And I congratulate the honourable gentleman for securing this important debate. I'd like to pay tribute to the strength of argument and strength of feeling that we've heard from members so far. I'd like to put on record that no one in this chamber wants to assist the IRA in any way to clean their record. And I hope that this debate can be held across both sides of the House and all sides of the House in firm agreement that there is no one here who wants to do that. That is not what this is about. This is about one piece of legislation. It's not about an old piece of legislation. It's not about some instrument that has brought about the so far quite consistent peace we've had now within the UK for a generation. It's not about that. It's about something very new that was brought in about a year and a half ago. And we've heard from members opposite that they passionately support it, many of whom served for many years in this place without that piece of legislation and without even asking for it or campaigning for it. So now that it came in a year and a half ago, some people very much for it. There are problems on both sides of this piece of legislation, and one thing I'd like to hear is balance in this argument. On one side, we have the absolute desire to prosecute, go after, and bring justice for IRA terrorists and what they've done. They should absolutely not be walking free, in my opinion. There are victims' families, British people in this country, British people, who cannot see justice because of this act of legislation. On the other side of this argument, in the interest of balance, we need to protect our veterans. We have to do that. Now, personally, I have an interest in this because I represent Plymouth Moor View. We had 500 people sign this petition. You don't need to organise a veterans' coffee morning to meet a veteran in Plymouth. You just pretty much go outside your house and you can have a chat with your neighbour. And I served in the Royal Marines, where most of the men who trained me were training and saying, this is how we did this in Northern Ireland. So that memory lives very long. Yes, I will.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. He's giving a very powerful speech. I'd just like to ask him to put on record whether he thinks any of those 500 veterans that he has met are naive.
Just to clarify what I said there are 500 veterans in Plymouth Moor View who signed the petition. So I'm not sure I could answer him in that respect, because I didn't meet with them recently to talk about this. And I don't think anyone is suggesting that veterans themselves are naive.
Absolutely.
So let me continue, if I may. Context is absolutely king. Okay, context, I've just taken one, so. Context is king. We've had peace for a generation. And while members have laid out passionately the wrongs, the ills and the evils of the IRA in some detail, going through operational detail, which I appreciate, there's slightly not the argument anyone's making here. No one is suggesting that any of those things were in any way justified. No one's doing that here. What we are discussing is a piece of legislation that, in order to buy the protection of veterans, allows for the protection of terrorists. We are saying, I don't think that's correct. I think we need to be able to go after those terrorists. And there's a bigger context, isn't there? The bigger... Not quite yet. The bigger context is this. The world is extremely insecure at the moment. We all hope and pray that this country never has to go to war again. Personally, I think we might have to in the foreseeable future. We hope that does not happen. When and if that happens, we need to have the moral, the legal, and the total legitimacy to go in with extreme force and do what needs to be done. And if we start passing laws, as we did a year and a half ago, that eat away, they nibble away at our international reputation for being a lawful and professional military, then we are going to struggle to do that in years to come. That is a bigger context that we need to keep in mind. I'm going to take an intervention.
The Operation Bill, which I sat on the Bill Committee, covered that. I also sat on the Bill Committee of the Northern Ireland Legacy Act that we're going through now, and saw the months of trying to get something that we can get through the House that protects veterans. And we mentioned about naivety. I really believe that people might be doing things for the right reason. If we adjust this and change it, our veterans will face prosecution. And I defy anybody that thinks otherwise.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his service on those Bill committees. I don't agree with what you've said, but that is the nature of the exact debate we're having here, so I'm willing to have it. It's been alluded to, and I'll close my speech with this, that we are yet to see from the government what the safeguards will be for veterans. And I will say this quite openly, I need to see those. We all need to see those. What I would ask from the members opposite, and all members in this House, is bear in mind the two big bits of context I hope I've been able to introduce, which is peace for a generation and a very, very threatening world picture and the need for moral legitimacy. Thank you.
I call Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I want to thank all the residents from South Shropshire who've signed the petition or seen me, and all the veterans that have come down today. So I just think it's right to point out that my dad served one of the first SAS troops over into Northern Ireland in the 70s, and I served 18 months during the Troubles on Banner. So I have first-hand experience of that. But what I thought about today is, how do I share some of that experience to put the reality back of what it's like being a soldier on operations? So I was a teenager when I deployed on my first tour to Belfast. I had little understanding of the big political situation, but I knew everything I needed to do, what I could and couldn't do, and all the rules of engagement. And everybody on the tour followed these. Our pre-deployment training, that one of the colleagues has mentioned, was extensive. For months, we covered every possible scenario that you could face when overseas on operations, when in Northern Ireland on operations. And I was a rifleman with the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Green Jackets. They were tough soldiers, but professional, knew what they could and couldn't do. So let's throw a little context of what it can be like when on operations over in Northern Ireland. If you imagine you're patrolling round what could be something like a normal housing estate in the UK, yes, there would be different some more areas more run down than the other, but the structure is the same. So when you're walking past somebody, you don't know if that person is going to buy something from the shops, pick up their children, or plan to kill you. You don't know what their intentions are. When a car speeds around the corner, as you see so every day on our streets, you do not know if that person is somebody late to pick something up, to go to an event, a joyrider, or somebody driving past to do a drive-by shooting to kill you and your colleagues. You do not know that. But these things happen all the time. You never really knew anybody's intention. And in 1996, in the middle of my tour, there was a decision over Drumcree to not allow a march to go through. And what was a semi-stable environment, within a matter of hours, turned into complete carnage, rioting and people being burned out of houses up and down the whole of the area. And all of a sudden, the whole of law and order and the rule of law had completely broken down. I believe in a matter of about 4 days, there was about 750 RUC injured, of which 4 were shot on patrol with us in one night. So whatever you thought it was like many years later discussing this, you have to add the extreme pressure, the mental pressure that you're facing, looking under your vehicle every single day. Is it a car bomb? And when we were in the riots, when somebody goes to throw a brick, a stone, you have a split second to react. Is that a grenade? Is it an improvised weapon? Every one of those is designed to cause you harm, and some of them are designed to kill you. And you have that split second to decide, do I open fire, or do me and my colleagues get killed? You do not know. That pressure, where you might have been out for many, many hours with very little sleep, but we knew what we had to do. Many soldiers that served in Northern Ireland spend every day remembering their colleagues that did not return, and spend every day trying to forget what they saw and what they witnessed by waking at night through screams. This has not left many people. We've asked them to go and do the most extreme things in the most difficult conditions. And I was proud that this government, in my mind, was too late anyway, but brought the Legacy Act in, which I sat on the Bill Committee, because it meant a protection for our veterans. And that's what I campaigned for. I had spoke many times before, and I had seen and knew colleagues that had faced this prosecution or the threat of prosecution for their time. And I believe the whole veteran community at the moment sees the repealing of this legislation as a body blow. And I do not think the government has realised the size of the anger that the community is going to face on this.
May I interview?
Yes.
Thank you very much. My son is a serving soldier now, and he tells me that many are leaving the forces because of this. We are tens of thousands below in our recruitment level. And would you comment on whether you think he is right and this is damaging our ability to defend our country?
I thank the honourable member Sons for his service. Mine joins in 2 months at the age of 16. And I hope in 30 years down the line, when he's defended his country, as your son has, they are not going through this. Because morale is rock bottom over this. And there isn't naivety from veterans or different people. I will give way.
And the honourable member is welcome to check Hansard after this. I was very specifically referring to those, and we all know that these people exist, who are scaremongering and do not know the details of the bill and naively are just making up opinions that are not based on evidence. At no point did I say that any veteran is naive, and I know the honourable gentleman has too much respect for the procedures and fellow colleagues here to keep repeating that when it is not true.
Yeah. I actually think that all the veterans in here believe that the current route from the government is wrong. So are they misguided or are they naive? But currently, if this is changed and we go down this route, I can guarantee that our veterans are going to face prosecution for the service that they have done and given for their country for many years. I will do.
Our veterans don't need to read the bill. They just need to look at the outcome of the Clono inquiry. 4 potential manslaughter prosecutions.
As I summarise, Mr. Chairman, we ask our veterans, we ask them to defend us. We ask them to do the hardest things while people sleep soundly in their beds at night. And we will face more conflicts in the future. I hope we never see them, but we will face these. We have to have a moral compass to make sure that we can protect those that protect us. And I demand of the government that we set out that the current route will make sure that no prosecution happens for our veterans, because you've even heard a Secretary of State from your own side. They are not reassured at the moment, but we need to see that no veterans are thrown to the wolves, and we need to protect them for those that have served the country with the utmost pride. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mandel. To speak in today's debate and to serve under your chairmanship. And I thank those who signed the petition that has brought us here today. The petitioners are absolutely clear. The government must do nothing that would allow Northern Ireland veterans to be prosecuted for doing their duty. The critical 3 words, doing their duty in combating terrorism as part of Operation Banner. And with that sentiment, I stand resolutely with them. This is a simple and powerful demand, and one that should be respected, understood and agreed. It's an issue it's not just a legal matter, it's about justice, trust in public service and the promise we make to those that risk their lives in the name of our country. Now, as my honourable and gallant friends have said, and it is a privilege to serve in this place with them, I do understand the government's position that the previous legislation passed by the Conservatives has been found to be unlawful, that it is not supported by any political party in Northern Ireland for the various reasons that have been highlighted by the honourable gentleman, and that it gives an amnesty to terrorists, murderers of British soldiers. However, in replacing it, any new legislation must uphold one central commitment: we will protect our veterans. I have met with constituents in Hartlepool who served in Northern Ireland with distinction, professionalism and bravery. One constituent in particular, who I met with last month, served with honour, carrying out his duties at great risk to himself. Not only does he have to live with the scars of the past that almost every veteran in any conflict faces, he told me that he now lives every day with the thought that one knock on the door can mean him being dragged into a vexatious legal nightmare. We cannot allow this to happen. These people are not looking for special treatment. They're only asking for fairness. Fairness in the recognition that they served under the command of the state. Fairness in the understanding that historical investigations, too numerous to count, have already been carried out, many of them at the time that they first occurred. And fairness in not being treated as political scapegoats decades after the events in questions. The legacy of the conflict should not be ignored, but we cannot have a system where those who serve the state under its orders face endless scrutiny for the rest of their lives. The current framework fails everyone. And it fails the future because it undermines the possibility of truth and reconciliation by giving neither side confidence that the process is fair or final. The previous Conservative government claimed their legislation would draw a line under the past. It was a hollow claim. It has done the opposite. It has stirred up more anger, reopened more wounds, and brought more uncertainty to the people who have already given enough. I urge the government to think very carefully about the next steps they take if they want to restore the faith of the veteran community in this country. Mr. Mundell, we routinely ask our armed forces to do extraordinary things in impossible circumstances. We must not abandon them decades later for doing what they were asked to do. If we are serious about supporting veterans, it cannot just be words, it must be action. The government must deliver for those who served. The veterans of Operation Banner deserve nothing less.
Ryan Matthew.
It's an honour to serve under your chairship, and I thank the honourable members for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk for bringing this important debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. I, like many in this place, have skin in this game. In my case, members of my family were brought up in Northern Ireland, and I remember my first trip there as a small boy and seeing for the first time armed police on the streets, something we now hardly stop to think about. I remember many years later, my father, a veteran himself, talking on the Good Friday Agreement and how that since the IRA had put down its guns and its bombs, Sinn Féin should be free to participate in politics, just as any political party is free to do, a dividend for peace. My father passed away in 1995 and my mother in 1998, just a few months before the dreadful Omagh bombing. And I remember thinking at the time, thank God she didn't have to witness that in the beloved town of her birth. Truth and reconciliation is important. Its implementation in South Africa was a great thing, but it needs trust and it needs full disclosure to be true to itself. Going forward, the government is seeking to repeal the Legacy Act, and good reasons have been put forward for it to go, as it could be argued that it has interrupted the process of truth and reconciliation that still leaves over 1,000 families in limbo, including those of our veterans and their families. If the government is to do away with the Legacy Act, then it does need to leave something better in its place, something perhaps akin to the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa, something that families from all sides and none in the Troubles can rely on for closure, with protection for our veterans. Thank you.
And I call Paul Foster.
Thank you, Mr Mundell, for allowing me to contribute to today's petition debate. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm not going to take any interventions. I'm going to be as short as I can so as many members can speak. Let me start by reminding everyone once again, I'm a proud retired Royal Engineer. And although I didn't serve on Op Banner, many colleagues and friends did. The Op Banner veterans did their duty in exceptionally challenging circumstances, and I commend them all, each and every one of them. I would also point out to colleagues that despite not serving on Op Banner, I was in cadet barracks in Osnabrück in Germany when it was attacked by the IRA in June 1996. I get it. I really do. Mr Mundell, what is of the utmost importance is that we deal in facts and facts alone. Fact one, the previous Conservative government which pushed through the Legacy Act in 2023. The Act created one route for dealing with the past through the creation of the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Retrieval. It received almost unanimous condemnation from victims groups and the political parties in Northern Ireland. And I accept what was said before for differing reasons. Fact two, the previous Conservative government publicly stated at the time
despite numerous challenges, that the Act would be fully compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights, the Windsor Framework and the Good Friday Agreement. And they knew that this most certainly was not the case. In February 24, the Northern Ireland High Court found the Act was in fact incompatible with the European Court of Human Rights, specifically Articles 2, 3 and 6, and it was therefore deemed unlawful. They also found that it was incompatible with Article 2 of the Windsor Framework, and therefore should be disapplied. If the previous government knew that this was the case, they should have never proceeded in pushing the Legacy Act through Parliament. It was deliberate and wholly irresponsible course of action. No, I'm making progress. Fact 3. In January 24, the Irish government lodged an interstate application against the United Kingdom before the European Court of Human Rights on the basis of this Legacy Act violating Articles 2, 3, 6, 13 and 14 of the Convention. This case against the United Kingdom government is still live. So, Mr Mundell, these are indisputable facts. If an Act of Parliament is found to be unlawful, the government must act. However, the repealing of the Legacy Act is not a simple exercise. We all understand that, and any changes introduced must offer the protection that our veterans, victims and impacted families all deserve. My deep concern is that with any new legislation, we must ensure a wholly comprehensive approach to dealing with the past in Northern Ireland, which recognises the unique position our veterans find themselves in. They deserve our continued and unwavering support. I'm also profoundly concerned at the continued politicisation of our veterans and misinformation being continually spouted by Conservative members of Parliament, who should know better. This issue is an issue all members of all political persuasions should be working on together, not seeking political gain with inaccurate and misleading statements. The Unlawful Legacy Act made false and undeliverable promises to our veterans about immunity, and I say again, it has been repeatedly ruled unlawful. It generated false expectations, legal uncertainty and delays for victims, survivors and veterans alike. It was opposed by many, including armed forces families who lost relatives serving in Northern Ireland. It gives immunity to terrorists who murdered British soldiers. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, the Defence Secretary and the Minister for Veterans are working tirelessly together to put in place protections for our veterans and to ensure that legacy mechanisms are fair, lawful and proportionate. The Minister for Veterans, sat here with us, has met with hundreds of veterans and veterans organisations since taking office, including the Royal British Legion and representatives from all major military associations with Northern Ireland service experience, listening to their concerns and incorporating their feedback into the new approach. These are not new arguments, and we've had alternative solutions before that just haven't worked. This is a hugely complex and emotive issue. All members of Parliament should be working as one to bring about a lawful solution, supporting ministers and veterans alike, not spreading a fake narrative. Our veterans will continue to receive the full support of this government, and any new legislation must be carefully considered. And I give my word to each and every one of you that it will be. Thank you.
Before I call the next speaker, the chair will change during the course of the next contribution. If everyone is not able to be called, it's my responsibility and not Ms. Lewell's, because I have chosen to allow more substantial contributions in this debate for the benefit of the debate. And I call Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Mundell, I'm grateful for your tolerance. Can I start by simply saying to the last intervener, and one or two others on the other side, that to accuse people like myself who served in Northern Ireland for supporting the Legacy Act and then demeaning ourselves by apparently making it out that we're attacking others is utter nonsense. We are after one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to find a way to protect those veterans that have been pursued through the courts in a vexatious manner and destroying their lives in their latter years. That is the sole purpose of why I supported the Legacy Act. Even though I had my doubts about it, I still supported it for that reason. There was no other purpose that was on the table to be able to provide that support for those veterans. So I really take it ill, and I think the honourable gentleman demeans himself by attacking people on that personal basis. Can I say, Mrs. Lowell, that this is an issue about inconsistency, really, and it covers all previous governments. The problem is that originally were involved in LOAC, which was the law of armed conflict, which settled these issues. We've had a collision with the Human Rights Act, which has now changed everything. And the real point about this is there is no moral equivalence between people who set out to kill, maim and destroy in a democracy, as has happened in Northern Ireland, was laid out by my honourable friend in front of me here at the moment. The reality here, quite clearly, is that there is no equivalence at all. Those British servicemen who went to Northern Ireland, ordered to go to Northern Ireland, did so out of their duty to protect the citizens of Northern Ireland against an insurrection, violent and destructive. And the idea that there is some kind of equivalence here, that if you can't proceed against IRA terrorists, then you've taken them out of the equation. I have to tell anybody in the House, go back and find out when was it we have pursued IRA terrorists through the court. There is no evidence. There was no records kept. And they know very well, if you're going to get, as my honourable friend said, 400 witness statements from people who know they are protected by the lack of evidence, then really you must be living in a different world from the one that I'm living in. The reality is the only people that will be prosecuted, unless this government does something absolutely to end that process, will be the veterans. And even if they don't get prosecuted and eventually found guilty, it is the persecution and the chasing of them that ruins their lives and makes them worry for the rest of their lives, having served their country. I will indeed.
Overstated, because many Northern Ireland veterans already suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health problems. I speak as a Vice President of the mental health charity Combat Stress. And the idea, the very idea, there are people who at the moment are nowhere near a prosecution or a potential prosecution who are now haunted, not only by the trauma of their service, but now haunted by the possibility that they're going to be dragged to a court and exposed in some way, with their families saying, "Daddy, did you really do something wrong?" It cannot be overstated how utterly, utterly brutal this is, and it is a deliberate campaign by those who are trying to bring these prosecutions.
Indeed, I agree with him, and that is what is really hanging over us, which is that if nothing is done, and if this existing act is repealed, then we are left with the single problem that it started with: how do we protect those veterans from vexatious persecution which has been going on? And I have lots of respect for many on the other side, particularly the Veterans Minister. He knows very well that that is their interest. I say to them simply, you cannot repeal an act without replacing it with the main position that is the protection for those veterans who served their country. I served in Northern Ireland. I didn't ask to go to Northern Ireland. I went out with my regiment, the Scots Guards, and we served, I think, pretty well in Northern Ireland. But we didn't want to be there, to be spat at by people in the United Kingdom, to be thought of and wondering, as the honourable gentleman said, around the corner, what's coming next. All of that was what we put up with in the United Kingdom. It's a unique experience. It's not like going abroad to fight a war. Being on the streets of the United Kingdom and then carrying a rifle, trying to protect those who are also under attack from those who would will their destruction, is something very peculiar. And yet my soldiers and many others acted with the most phenomenal restraint. Provocation was there all the time, but they acted with such utmost restraint. I know of no other country whose soldiers would have ever done this, no matter what their background was. And I am proud immensely proud to have been one of them, and I think that we should stop demeaning each other about politics in this. This is about protection, and we should be talking about that. I want to say that I lost a very good friend in Northern Ireland, and it's pretty awful, really, when you think back to what has actually happened. The reality was Robert Nairac was kidnapped. He was tortured for a long time. We know not what has happened to his body, although we may guess. But he was executed after having escaped. That much we do know. No one from the IRA who committed that atrocity will ever, I suspect, be held to account in any court of law. That is the injustice of this process. His parents died never knowing where his body was, and his family today still do not know. Talk about injustice. That is injustice. I give way.
I thank the honourable member for his service, and I agree with him that that is a gross injustice. Would he support a new investigation into his friend's death if new evidence were to emerge? And does he appreciate that the existing Legacy Act would prevent that, which is one of the reasons why it needs to be repealed?
I was attacking equivalence. The reality is, right now, if we get rid of the Legacy Act, what will happen is back to a one-sided process where veterans will be pursued, but nobody in the IRA is going to come in front of the courts, and many of them have these ridiculous letters of comfort given to them, as well, as the honourable gentleman said earlier on. So that equivalence is a distraction. The reality is, of course, I want to see those people prosecuted, but are we going to get witness statements from people who have run and hidden in other countries? I doubt it very much. And well, I will last time. Okay.
Thank you. The fact is that the only likelihood of ever finding out what happened to Captain Nairac's body would be if somebody came forward to the Truth and Reconciliation body, which is part of the Legacy Act legislation, in return for immunity, and told people where it was. There'll be no other way of finding out.
Actually, I was going to come to that point. My right honourable friend has guessed my mind, not that it's that deep that he won't get to it, but I'd simply say to him, of course, that was the whole reason why, in the end, even though we had our doubts, we did support this, because we thought, on balance, there was at least the likelihood of getting to the bottom of many of these unexposed cases and of the deaths and the violence that took place, knowing full well that those from the IRA will never be prosecuted for this, and we will never know otherwise. And so that's why I support it. And I simply say to the House today that this issue cannot proceed, the government cannot proceed now unless it is able categorically to be able to give us the clarity that there is legislation that will protect those veterans from that vexatious pursuit that has been so much in their minds and their worries throughout this period. If we cannot give them that, if the government cannot legislate that, then there is no purpose in getting rid of the existing act without it. That has to be the point. And the reality is, the government may not like it, but they have to face this reality that there cannot be pursuit of veterans if they have had inquiries previously, as my right honourable friend said, that has cleared them of whatever the charge was before. This repeat process on absolutely no evidence whatsoever that has been taking place is what has caused all the worry to our veterans. So I simply say, if we care about our veterans, then we should not rush to make a change to the existing legislation until we are able to confirm to these brave men and women who served so loyally to their country on behalf of those who lived as civilians in Northern Ireland for their protection. Our duty, therefore, and the duty of the government, is if we cannot find that solution, do not tamper with what exists for fear of destroying the one protection that we will have given those veterans.
Ellie Chow?
Thank you, Mr. Well, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship.
I rise to represent my constituency of North Herefordshire, which is home to the 22nd SAS Regiment, the Special Reconnaissance Regiment and the 18th Signals Regiment. I'm sure that the House will wish to join me in recognising the professionalism and the dedication of the men and women who make up these regiments and who are such an integral and highly respected part of the Herefordshire community. This is reflected by the fact that over 1,000 people in my constituency signed this petition, second only to the number of signatories in the neighbouring Hereford and South Herefordshire constituency. Northern Ireland legacy matters are, of course, incredibly sensitive, as indeed we have seen today, and it's absolutely vital that legacy processes are based upon a fair, balanced and comprehensive approach, and that these processes are implemented with the necessary rigour, independence and, crucially, consultation with all of the affected communities, including armed forces veterans. For all those communities affected by the Troubles, legacy processes should provide as much certainty and expediency as possible. It's hugely regrettable that the unworkable Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Act 2023 did not deliver this, not least because of its failure to comply with the UK's obligations under the ECHR. It's important to recognise here that the result of this has been enormous uncertainty, stress and loss of trust felt across all communities affected by the Troubles, and it's vital to now apply the necessary rigour to avoid further mistakes. During the past months, I've had the privilege of meeting many serving and veteran members of the armed forces, including UK Special Forces and those who served in Northern Ireland during Operation Banner, to listen to their views and concerns about the government's proposals to repeal and replace the Legacy Act. I've heard how strongly my constituents believe in accountability and the rule of law, and the pride that they have always taken in conducting themselves with the utmost professionalism. What's also come across loud and clear is just how many have lost trust in the handling of legacy processes. My constituents have said they feel badly let down by successive governments. Many are still caught up in legacy processes, facing additional years of uncertainty and stress after decades of the same. And they've told me that veterans have lost trust in attempts to achieve reconciliation, that the anger, frustration and embitterment at their treatment will need to be addressed if they are to be persuaded to take part in future reviews and investigations. This is all deeply regrettable. Now, after I wrote to both the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and the Secretary of State for Defence to outline my constituents' concerns several months ago, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland responded, commending the bravery of those Northern Ireland veterans who did so much to keep people safe during the Troubles, recognising the extreme circumstances under which they were operating. He also stated that with the passage of time, the likelihood of further prosecutions is increasingly unlikely, and he gave an assurance that there will be no rewriting of history and that he will engage fully with the veteran community as the government moves forwards with its plans to repeal and replace the Legacy Act. And I welcome this commitment to engagement. The government has announced that it will bring forward primary legislation when parliamentary time allows. But for those communities left in limbo by the Legacy Act and the subsequent legal challenges, this is a vague commitment with no clear time frame, which does not reflect the anxiety and uncertainty currently felt. So can I ask, will the government therefore provide greater clarity about the timetable of plans and commit to bringing forward primary legislation in this Parliament? Ending the uncertainty and finding a workable resolution to legacy issues is imperative, and it's therefore critical that the government gets this right. And so can the Secretary of State therefore respond to the concerns that have been raised about the Independent Commission on Reconciliation and Information Recovery, especially in relation to independence, powers and accountability? Given the Secretary of State's assurance that he will engage fully with communities, will he commit to visiting North Herefordshire to meet my constituents and hear their concerns directly? I'd like to end on this point. Throughout my meetings with constituents, with veterans over the past few months, they have emphasised the meticulous planning, preparation and professionalism that goes into armed forces operations. Can the Secretary of State reassure my constituents that the same level of rigour will be applied by the government as it moves forward in repealing and replacing the legacy legislation? Thank you.
Norman.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chairman. It's very good to see you in the chair today. I'm speaking with the permission of the Speaker and the Clerk as a member of the Shadow Front Bench, because this is a matter of the utmost importance to my constituents. If you look on the petitions map, you will see that Herefordshire has a dark brown colour, showing that it has the highest percentage of veterans who have signed this petition, and of those two constituencies, mine is the highest of all. And that is because so many of my constituents, 1,159, are veterans of special forces and other regiments. And I speak on their behalf. These are men now, many of them in their 70s, who have had their lives blighted. It is a nonsense to suggest somehow that there is political scaremongering here. These are men who have sat in front of me and with all the astonishing bravery and the astonishing vigour and fortitude that they've shown, they have flinched in the face of the legal challenge and the vexation and the worry that this has caused them and their families and their communities. And we must recognise that. I say one other thing, which is I speak also on behalf of Anthony Daly, a great friend of mine, who died at the age of 24 in the Hyde Park bombing on the soil of England because of the IRA. Let it never be forgotten that the IRA is not just any other terrorist organisation. It was the most professional terrorist organisation in the world at the time. It trained and supplied other organisations of similar kind around the world. And it was, therefore, an astonishing thing for this country to send young men and some women into that cauldron in order to defend all of the rights we take for granted today. Men who acted under orders, men who acted in a chain of command, on the Queen's business, and who cannot now respond, in many cases of my constituents, to the terrible injustice that is being wrought at the moment, which is itself already proving, I'm sorry to say, even amongst this group, dangerous and deleterious to their morale. And there is something fundamentally dishonest about the government's position here, Madam Chair, if I may say so, which is that it has not bothered to explain the basis of the legal reasoning that is used. And I want to invite the Secretary of State to clarify that basis in this chamber today. And if he cannot, I want him to write to me so that we can share in public what the reasons for this legal reasoning is. Articles 46 and 47 were not controversial when they were passed. They were passed with the support of the then opposition, now the government. The government is therefore absurd to hear colleagues from across the chamber suggesting somehow that these were always something that they disagree with, or they've now suddenly discovered some whip's interest. Let me say this. Will the Secretary of State now say at the dispatch box and to us all the answer to the following questions? Why did the government abandon the appeal? How is the legislation in sections 46 and 47 incompatible with the Convention rights? How exactly is it incompatible? Did it give thought to allowing that supposed incompatibility to continue, given that it's under no legal obligation to cure it? Why did it not simply allow the pattern of the normal course of law to proceed and let the Supreme Court make that decision? And why, above all, did it not decide on its own solution before it decided to create all this uncertainty from abandoning the appeal?
Jim Shannon.
Pleasure to serve under your chairship. And can I commend the honourable gentleman for setting the scene on behalf of the Petitions Committee as well. I really appreciate it. It's something that we've all spoken on repeatedly. However, let me be very clear. I will not tire of speaking up for our veterans and the entirely and vexatious prosecution of them. I declare an interest as one who served in the Ulster Defence Regiment for 3 years as a part-time soldier in an anti-terrorism role, served as 11.5 years as a member of the Royal Artillery, obviously the Cold War role, but the fact was to be a soldier in Northern Ireland, whether you were in the Ulster Defence Regiment or indeed in any other regiment, you were under threat, and we very clearly were. I want to take up the comment that somebody made about the yellow card. I know whenever as an 18-year-old, 19, 20-year-old, I had, as we all did, we read out our yellow card every night before we left. Not one of those soldiers that I served alongside, or any of them that I knew, ever disregarded that yellow card and what they did. And it was quite clear the role that a soldier had to play. Now, we all know why these cases exist. To say that it's a seat justice does not paint the whole picture. The cases are pressed by Republicans in an attempt to whitewash the history into a Hollywood version that paints them as freedom fighters oppressed by an evil regime. Well, no, it's not. This is not the case. The blood of those who were murdered at chip shops, burnt alive with a napkin, and that palm-like substance went out for a meal in a restaurant, who were mowed down with machine guns when attending their church. The blood of these innocent victims cries out against all attempts, Madam Chair, to change the appearance from pure evil to justifiable. These atrocities and crimes can never, ever be justified. So there's no Hollywood lens that can ever be focused to make it seem that the Oma bombing, which will happen, a statement about that shortly in the Chamber, was in pursuit of a noble cause. It wasn't. It never can be. The reason these soldiers were stationed in Northern Ireland was to deal with the very real and lethal threat of those paramilitaries of all beliefs, loyalism and Republican alike. It was under this threat that these soldiers operated. I just was saying to one of the girls in the office last week, in March 1971, 3 off-duty soldiers, 3 Scottish soldiers, were lured from a bar by an IRA operative and murdered along the road on the way to a party. They were not on duty, Madam Chair. They were off duty, but the IRA seen them as targets. And when our British Army were on duty, they were checking cars at road checkpoints to find razors hidden in car seats, where, with the express purpose of injuring them, they were ambushed on the roads, shot at and killed or maimed. The circumstances that they operated under were not those of war, as it had been known. It was guerrilla warfare, and these men were in constant high alert. Indeed, their mental health continues to pay the price for this very high alert today. The reason that I highlight that, Madam Chair, if I can please, is twofold. Firstly, in a situation which is highly charged, when you know your life is on the line at any second, the high alert means that a split-second decision you took 40 or 50 years ago may be difficult for you to remember and justify just now. To expect these men to come to court to give an account on the detail of cases is simply untenable, especially since they were previously investigated and told there was no case to answer. So you can understand, Madam Chair, why we ask the question, why do it again? Secondly, the harm that trying to put yourself back in these positions and your mental stability is incredibly difficult, indeed can be damaging. And to ask them to go back there is simply traumatizing them, those who did nothing but follow an order. Now, were we really discussing cases where a soldier or a personnel went off in their own cognizance and carried out an attack, then by all means hold them accountable and let them mount their defence. But that is not what we're questioning here. Today, we are asking 80-year-old men, for example, how they carried out the order 50 years ago, when they saw when they carried out and why they did that. This is simply not fair, nor is it just. The Army reviewed decisions taken at the time and brought people to justice for miscarriages of justice. Government cannot come into a civil court 50 years later and re-traumatise these men for doing what their officers required from them when there's no case to answer. That is why I believe these vexatious claims must stop. There can be no true justice when these men were acting under orders and the message this sends to serving personnel. This can't be the message sent today, and I wish to put my record quite clear. A pithy one, Sammy, if you can know what pithy is, okay? Yeah.
And will you accept the fact that people are being dragged to the court, sometimes for the second and third time, that this is not about justice, it's not about accountability, it's about harassment, and it's about an attempt to try and find ways of rewriting history, and that's why this is so wrong.
Yeah. And thank the honourable member for that, and yes, that was pithy. Well done. Just to say, Madam Chair, that he's absolutely right. It's a rewriting of history. It's the injustice done to soldiers who served, and each one. And there's many in this room who served, and indeed the minister himself, who's here, who is honourable and gallant member. But I conclude with these words, Madam Chair, because I'm conscious others want to speak, and I'm certainly not going to take any more than my 5 minutes. These men served under circumstances that I can well remember, because I remember serving alongside them, and that many of you in this chamber may not be able to imagine what that all meant. They laid it on the line to protect us, and we have, I believe, Madam Chair, a duty to protect them from the re-imaging that Sinn Féin IRA seek to carry out to justify their evil events. We can never believe that this is a fight for freedom. This is a fight against a faceless, brutal, murderous enemy that haunts service personnel to this day.
Lincoln Jock.
Thank you, Mr. Lewell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to thank the 170,000 people who signed the petition, particularly those from my Spelthorne constituency. I served 4 tours in Northern Ireland, dedicated 3.5 years of my life to trying to bring peace to that place. And the first tour I did was in Belfast in 1992. It was a guinea a minute. It was a young Captain Jock and a young Lieutenant Ben Wallace on the same tour. And the IRA at the time were fully aware of our rules of engagement, the so-called yellow card that's been referenced today. In fact, they designed a whole weapons system around it. It was called the coffee jar bomb. It was a coffee jar, funnily enough, usually Nescafe, although other coffees are available. And they would take a small piece of scaffolding, put that in the coffee jar, put a detonator in, a small amount of Semtex, and what was affectionately known as shipyard confetti. A plunger switch from a fridge so that when the coffee jar was thrown and broke on the ground, the bomb went off and the bits went everywhere. We knew that they were incredibly lethal because a year before, one had been thrown at a dog handler who was feeding his dog, a guy called Darren, and he had watched as his left leg had flown 20 meters away. His other leg, a smouldering wreck. So we knew they were very dangerous. And when we were training for it, we went on this cine range. And you would be there with a subcal looking at a movie screen of a street scene. And the film would stop and you would see a threat. And you're trained when you go to Northern Ireland to try to identify the presence of the abnormal or the absence of the normal in order to set the context. And you would see a perceived threat and the threat would build up and they would invite you to fire your round. A little yellow dot went onto the screen and your instructor would say, congratulations, you've successfully carried out the rules of engagement. Except the coffee jar bomb, of course, presented a massive dilemma because could you shoot someone simply for having a coffee jar in their hand or indeed being in the process of throwing it? It was purely designed to put soldiers like me and all those other 24,000 who served there under incredible pressure. And I remember there was one particular moment, there was a real dilemma in the cine film, and the instructor said, I said, can I fire now? And he said, that is a very tough moment. And that is a moment when you remind yourself, sir, that it is sometimes better to be tried by 12 men than carried by 6. Pretty chilling, particularly subsequently in that tour, when 2 of our guardsmen were in a judgmental shooting situation, one of them believing that they'd seen a coffee jar bomb in a plastic bag. Turns out you don't get tried by 12 men, you get tried by 1, and they were convicted and given life imprisonment. But that's the point. All of these cases that we're coming here to talk about have been rigorously gone through a judicial process at the time. And it is horrific double jeopardy, in some cases treble jeopardy, to put our veterans through this process again. And now the Veterans Minister knows this well, but there are 3 components to fighting power: the moral, the physical, and the conceptual. This is a very well-known model because Napoleon said the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. You undermine the moral component of fighting power at your peril. And I was appalled, really, to see a GIF recently. A veteran sent it to me on my phone. And it was a picture of Keir Starmer addressing a number of troops very recently. And the subtitle underneath was, we want you to go to Ukraine to do things which we're going to prosecute you for in 30 years' time. You undermine the moral component at your peril. And in order to understand the context in which these mendacious and vexatious prosecutions are going to be pursued, I remind the Secretary of State of the moment when Stormont was recalled because someone had put a vase of flowers in the lobby at Stormont. And the whole of Stormont had to be recalled in order to debate the colour of the flowers which had been put in the lobby at Stormont. Why was that? Because everything after the Good Friday Agreement becomes a proxy of the answer to the question, who won? The Good Friday Agreement was by necessarily a compromise. It was a peace agreement. But ever since, everyone has been trying to relitigate the question who won, and it is essential that we do not allow our veterans and their prosecution to become pawns in that proxy game in order to answer that question. So I would just leave it at that and remind, I think that the Veterans Minister and the Secretary of State are having a lively debate behind the scenes. I would just invite the Secretary of State to listen very carefully to the Veterans Minister, who has the ear of veterans. I think I know where the Veterans Minister is coming from, and I expect the government to do the right thing.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lewis, and I thank the Petitions Committee for allowing this debate today, but also the 176,000 petitioners who signed the petition. The Right Honourable Member for Goole and Puckington finished with a poem. Ms Lewis, in thinking about today's debate and really how to set the scene for some of the other Honourable Members in this place, I thought I would start with a poem. As poppy petals gently fall, remember us who gave our all, not in the mud of foreign lands, but buried in the desert sands, in Ulster's field and farm and town, for Manna's Lane and Drumlin Down. We died that violent death should cease, and Ulster men should live in peace. We did not serve because we hate, nor bitterness or hearts dictate, but we were they who must aspire to quench the flame of terror's fire. As buglers sound and pipers play, the proud battalions march away. Now may the weary violence cease, and let our country live in peace. Miss Lewis, that poem will be remembered by many sitting behind me because it is the UDR soldier poem written by Major John Potter. But it could reflect all of those who served in Northern Ireland, no matter what the cap badge or what cap badge they wore, and has been mentioned by many here in this debate today. But Ms Lewis, I think as we speak of those brave servicemen across this United Kingdom who came to Northern Ireland to protect democracy, to protect our citizens of this United Kingdom, and it was the Right Honourable Member for East Belfast said about the honour and the thanks that we owe to them. Ms Lewis, never should we forget that core, that special core of veterans who served in Northern Ireland, namely those members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, the Home Battalion of the RIR, and indeed the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Because unlike those other servicemen who proudly served, some of them who didn't return home, after their tour of duty was over, they returned to their barracks. They returned to their homes across this country. But for those members of the UDR, the men, the women of the RUC and the home battalions, they went home every night, every day, to their own homes, to their own workplaces. So as members have rightly said about not knowing who was round the corner, or what that drive-by backfire of a car could have meant, so many of those proud servicemen actually fell victim to the hands of workmates who were passing on that information in regards to their service and the duty that they had carried out. So when it comes to that defence, that protection, that we now, I believe, this place, no matter what government, no matter what colour, whether it be red, whether it be blue or another colour in this place, and the point scoring that has went on, I think, actually owes some of the disservice to those veterans who are listening and those who served in regards to that. There is a duty now to get this right in regards to make sure that those people who served aren't dragged through the courts.
Would the member give way?
I'll give way.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree with me, just on the point he's at now, that what we must avoid at all costs is the equating of those who went out meticulously planning to take life, planning for days, weeks, if not months, to take innocent life, with a split-second decision, which he has alluded to, by the forces of law and order that may result in death. And we must avoid that equation being regarded across society at all costs in the future.
And I thank the member for making that point, because there can be no equivalence, Ms Lewis, for somebody who went out with murder and mayhem intent in their mind, rather than those people who put on a uniform to stand in front of the entire society to show that they were there to defend law and order and protect, rather to take innocent life. So the concern now is that those people serving in Northern Ireland, who served in Northern Ireland, and it has been mentioned here and across the UK, that knock at the door, that entry into the yard, that car coming up the lane, that may in the past may have been someone coming to end their life, is now replaced by someone coming to take them, to summon them to court because of an action that they may or may have not done 50 years ago. And I think that was the point that the Honourable Member for Strangford was making. Ms Lewell, in conclusion, much has been said. Because I'm conscious of time, I could say so much more, but much has been said about what can be done to this piece of legislation and how it can be replaced. To the Secretary of State, I say this because I'm sure in his closing remarks, like in many other debates, he'll make much contribution to ICRA in regards to the Independent Commission Reconciliation and Information Recovery Body. What I would say to him, the lawfare against that body has already commenced, with the Commissioner of Human Rights in Northern Ireland is already out on the front page of one of the Irish newspapers today, actually denigrating and saying and calling into question the position of Sir Declan Morgan, the Chief Commissioner, and Peter Sheridan, the Commissioner for Investigations. And there already is a cohort, an organisation regards that, or a movement to have those dismissed, to actually undermine what I'm sure the government has, and I've heard the Secretary of State in the past say that that will be the answer and ICRA will be the solution to all legacy problems in Northern Ireland. So I'll say to the Secretary of State, can I give the commitment today that no matter what solution comes forward from the government, that he won't let that lawfare from republicanism and from those organisations actually displace what should be legally and rightfully done in supporting our veterans as well. And I'll leave him with that line of Major John Porter's poem, "Remember us who gave our all and don't see them unnecessarily prosecuted."
Sarah Pochin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It is an honour to serve under your chairmanship, and it is indeed an honour to be able to speak on this important and emotive issue and to this petition, which means so much to me personally and my constituents in Runcorn and Helsby. The treatment of our brave Northern Ireland veterans by this government and previous governments is a national disgrace. I speak from the heart as someone whose father served in Northern Ireland at the height of the Troubles. He was prepared to die to protect every single one of us in this room, either directly or indirectly. We should not be having this debate, Madam Chairman, a debate about honour and patriotism being rewarded with betrayal by our government. The IRA want to rewrite history. It is shameful that the British government is allowing hundreds of our Special Forces veterans to be investigated over incidents that occurred decades ago. Not yet. Decades ago in Northern Ireland to appease the Irish government. These courageous men should be enjoying their hard-earned retirement, not facing prosecution for defending the British people from IRA terrorists. The same British people who value these soldiers and who are outraged at the unfair and unjust action of this government. Why would a British government of any political leaning include this commitment in their manifesto? These brave soldiers were doing nothing more than carrying out orders from the government of the day, as they are trained to do without fear or question. They are fiercely loyal to their regiment, their government, and their monarch. Many were awarded bravery medals signed off by our late monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, and yet this government is now looking to renege on this. They faced extreme danger on our behalf. They were fearless on our behalf. They would have sacrificed their own lives for us, and hundreds did. Many of the so-called IRA victims killed were murderers and terrorists. How on earth can anyone stand up to defend these people over our special forces? And yet, this government rewards our bravest service personnel by bringing these prosecutions. They reward them by threatening legal action, by putting them through the stress of a trial, by ruining their lives when they deserve nothing but our respect, our support, and our gratitude. These prosecutions should not be allowed to happen. Why would we not defend those that defended us? Those that put their life on the line for us? Well, I will defend them, and my party will stand up for them. I will not stand by and remain silent. I will speak for them. I am humbled by what they did for us, and I know that the British people feel the same. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Ms Lewell. I share the dismay shown by the Honourable and Gallant Lady for North East Derbyshire and others when decrying the fact that the legacy legislation gave, as I use her own words, immunity to terrorists. What nobody has yet spelt out is why it gave immunity to terrorists. And there is a simple answer to that. It could not give immunity to our armed forces without giving immunity to terrorists as well. And so the question which honourable and right honourable members have to ask themselves is, unless they can come up with some brand new alternative that defeated the scrutiny and the inventiveness of successive governments in trying to grapple with this problem, the question that people have to ask themselves is, if the price of giving immunity to our veterans is that we have to give theoretical immunity to terrorists, most of whom have had practical immunity from prosecution for many years, and hardly any of whom are ever likely to be prosecuted, is that price worth paying? Because you cannot have it both ways. Now, something that's been said quite rightly earlier in the debate is that people should be trying to work across party lines to come to a solution on this. And I think that I can honestly claim to have been trying to do that for rather a long time. In 2017, the Defence Select Committee, which I was then chairing, published a report which was entitled Investigations into Fatalities in Northern Ireland Involving British Military Personnel, HC 1064, if anyone is interested. And the purpose of that report was to examine in great detail what the options were legally to enable the government of the day to protect our veterans. And that report was published in April 2017, but prior to that, on the 7th of March, we had a hearing of which I have made the Secretary of State aware and the Veterans Minister. We had a hearing where we had no fewer than 4 top professors of law taking part. And we were not asking them, they had a variety of views and preferences and personal attitudes towards what had happened in Northern Ireland and so forth. We were not asking them whether they approved of amnesties. We were asking them what is and is not legally possible. And what they told us was this, and I'm quite disappointed that no one has even uttered these words as far as I can see in the entire debate. it is possible to bring in a statute of limitation. And the requirement by law that something be investigated need not lead to somebody being prosecuted. And to quote Professor Philippe Sands, someone not unknown to the government, he stated in that hearing, the obligation to investigate is not an obligation to prosecute. It is not an obligation to take any particular steps. It is simply an obligation to find out the facts of what has happened and ascertain. What was made clear in the discussion with the 4 professors of law was that if a government was not to find itself guilty of behaving with impunity, a statute of limitation had to apply to everyone. This is where people get upset, because the people who support our armed forces don't want it to apply to the terrorists. And the people from the Republican movement don't want it to apply to our armed forces. But the fact of the matter is, if you're going to protect anyone from prosecution in these circumstances, you have to protect everyone. And someone who just focuses on the group being protected of which they disapprove is actually ducking the hard choice that we had to face. And somebody mentioned earlier trying to follow the model of Nelson Mandela. Very good point. That is precisely what the legislation tried to do. We satisfied ourselves that a truth recovery process coupled with a statute of limitation, and in other words, immunity for people who gave their evidence to the truth recovery process, such as what Mandela did in South Africa, was a way in which this problem could be laid to rest. When the government says that it plans to give our soldiers every support, that sounds to me like they accept the fact that cases are going to be brought and they're going to try and support them. But the punishment is the process. It is true that hardly anyone will probably end up going right through the process to the end. And let me insert something else that I referred to in an earlier intervention. And that is when people keep saying, you mustn't equate this and that, and people on both sides of the debate do that. I certainly don't equate soldiers with terrorists morally, but in applying the law has to be equal for everybody. And in fact, this has already been recognized in the 1998 Northern Ireland Sentences Act, which limits the time that anybody can serve actually in jail, even for the most heinous murders, to 2 years. That's the only time you will serve in jail. Now, it may be there are people who had relatives murdered, and who will derive great satisfaction that after all this time, the murderer will go to jail for such a short period. But the reality is the punishment does not fit the crime. And whereas at first some of us thought, oh, well, this is just a free pass for the IRA, I must say I won't name the minister concerned, but I and someone from the Labour side with a strong service background who's now a minister went to meet the Sinn Féin MPs in Parliament here, because they do have a presence here, even though they don't come to the chamber. And it was who said they believed that this 2-year limit applied to the soldiers as well as to their own allies. And we looked into it and we checked it with ministers, and that was found to be correct. So the fact is, we are already compromising, we are already treating both groups the same. And the question I was just about to finish, but I will give way.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving me that point. I have to declare, I think the Legacy Act as it was, having set up and run a peacemaking programme in Northern Ireland myself and done a master's degree in reconciliation studies, was very much not a South African style Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But what I would like to just ask is, he's talking about the equivocation between terrorists on one hand and our armed forces on the other hand. Simply ask, what would he say to victims and how they could pursue justice in the case of the Legacy Act as was?
I would say, first of all, how likely is it, do you think, that when you're talking about victims of terrorists, that terrorists who have not been prosecuted all these years are in future going to be prosecuted? And secondly, I would say, how do you think the victims felt in South Africa when a line was drawn in order for the sake of the society to move forward? And what the Legacy Act did was the least worst option. And the reality of it is, as we've heard previously, there is no obligation to act on the finding of incompatibility with the ECHR. The Joint Committee, and this is my final point, the Joint Committee on Human Rights published a report, proposal for a draft Northern Ireland Troubles, Legacy and Reconciliation Act 2023, Remedial Order 2024, which states at paragraph 20, it is a discretionary remedy, meaning the courts do not have to issue such a declaration of incompatibility with the ECHR when they find a provision to be incompatible with convention rights. A declaration of incompatibility has no legal effect and does not affect the ongoing validity of the incompatible legislation. It's merely a tool by which the courts can draw attention to an incompatibility. It is then for the government and Parliament to decide what action, if any, to take. And indeed, Section 4 of the Human Rights Act states that a declaration of incompatibility does not affect the validity, continuing operation or enforcement of the provision in respect of which it's given, and it's not binding on the parties to the proceedings in which it is made. Now, I accept that there are other legal problems as well, but the impression, I must say, that I get from the Secretary of State, who I've known for many years and much admire, is that he has set his face against this route of a statute of limitations coupled with a truth recovery process, and he's not really listening, and that's why we are not fighting to keep in place the one thing that could give protection to our Northern Ireland military veterans.
Before I call Jim Alistair, if the honourable member could keep his contribution to 4 to 5 minutes, then we may be able to get in 2 more backbenchers before I call the frontbenchers for their contributions. Jim Alistair.
Thank you, Ms. Will. I note the selective stricture following a speech which exceeded more than twice the limit that was allegedly set, but I'll do my best. Could I begin, as a member from a Northern Ireland constituency, by placing on record the heartfelt thanks of the people of Northern Ireland for the service of our military within Northern Ireland during our darkest days. Those who stood between us and the horrendous terrorist threat that we faced. And of course I include and associate myself with the remarks of the Honourable Member for Southampton. I include the gallant local security services of the UDR and the RIR. And we all in this House, who day and daily exercise freedoms, need to be mindful that when those freedoms were under the most horrendous terrorist attack, it was our security forces which stood between us and the destruction of all those freedoms. And to many who paid the ultimate sacrifice, I think we want to remember their service and their sacrifice today. Madam Chair, the route to prosecution of our security services is now through the inquest process. It is the inquest process which is poisoning the well of justice in Northern Ireland. Because remember this, an inquest, as has been said, is supposed to be about who died, where they died, and how they died. But we have allowed, or government has allowed, inquests in Northern Ireland become unfettered in their overreach, as illustrated most dramatically in the Canoe inquest, where every outcome was explored to the point where the judge presiding over that inquest reached wholly prejudicial findings, which then resulted in him saying, I am now referring this to the PPS. Now remember this, Madam Chair. Inquests operate on the standard of the balance of probabilities. That's how you reach a verdict in an inquest. But in a criminal prosecution, you reach a verdict by proving beyond all reasonable doubt. And yet we have had a situation where 4 soldiers, SAS soldiers, who according to the presiding judge were meant to say to 9 approaching fully armed IRA men with a huge machine gun on the back of their body, were supposed to step forward and say, hands up, please surrender. That's what, according to the coroner, that's what they were supposed to do. Even though those IRA men had just shot up a police station and had returned celebrating their actions by firing over the house of a deceased terrorist who had been one of their own. And then they arrive in a car park, and the coroner, in the most outrageous overreach, says they were ambushed by the SAS. And the soldiers should have said, hands up, please surrender. With no regard to the fact that facing 9 fully armed terrorists, you have to make a split-second decision. And here's the point I'm coming to. In England, that could not have happened. Because under the inquest rules in England, when a coroner reaches the view that there may have been some unlawful activity, he must stop the inquest and refer the matter to the PPS. That's the right way to go, because it's for the PPS, not the coroner, to cover the matter. It's for the PPS to decide the approach. And that is what the Secretary of State needs to do in Northern Ireland. He needs to bring into effect the same rules that govern inquests in Northern Ireland as do in England, so that if there is an allegation of illegality or it occurs to the coroner there might be, he stops the inquest. He sends it to the PPS rather than covering and giving an outlandish ruling, which then creates the public perception that there is huge criminality here. That's the lawful and proper way to go. And I must say I regret the fact that when a few weeks ago I wrote to the Secretary of State pointing that out, I got the limp response, well, really, it's a matter for the Justice Department in Northern Ireland. No, this government is said to be tackling legacy issues. And if this government is going to tackle legacy issues, then it needs to tackle and to stem, by tackling inquests, that route which is now producing the potential prosecution of some of the bravest of our citizens.
Ben Obsey-Jecty.
It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to thank the over 175,000 people, of which 403 were my constituents in Huntingdon, who signed this E-petition. I would like to start by paying particular tribute to the military personnel who served in Northern Ireland on Operation Banner from August 1969 to July 2007, what was the longest continuous operational deployment of our armed forces, and in which 722 service people lost their lives as a result of terrorist action, 1,441 in total. Over the last decade, we've seen myriad bodies established to investigate injuries and deaths during the Troubles. In this time, many have raised concerns about the reliability and credibility of evidence and witness statements, some from over 50 years ago, and some reopened investigations that had long since concluded and had a line drawn beneath them. And as a veteran myself of Iraq and Afghanistan, it's 15 years since I served in Afghanistan, and I would hate to think now that someone could quiz me on where I was stood on a particular day, whom I was stood next to, which direction I was facing in, and for those answers to perhaps dictate my freedom, how my family would be impacted and how those around me would be impacted as well. And to ask people to remember what they were doing over 50 years ago is absolutely ludicrous. This government has said that the last government's legislation was flawed and failed, and that they will amend it in a way that, I quote, honours our duty towards veterans. Amid so much anxiety being felt by veterans of Northern Ireland and their families, I would like to hear clarity from the Secretary of State in his wind-up as to how the government will honour their duty towards veterans with these actions, and clarity on exactly what they plan to do around taking the IRA to task on this, because the words from the backbenchers on the opposite side have very much indicated that the aim of this legislation is to prosecute the IRA going forwards, and I would like to hear from the Secretary of State as to what his plans are to make that process occur. Although a veteran myself, I never served on Operation Banner. My own service overlapped with the tail end of our operations in Northern Ireland, but it characterised so much of my training, understanding the lessons learned and the skills won across nearly 4 decades, skills that we applied to counterinsurgency operations in Iraq, 5s and 20s, rummages, public order, et al. Without such hard-won knowledge, my own experience in operations may have been very difficult, and my generation of soldiers, and now veterans, owe a debt of gratitude to those who served on Operation Banner. Growing up in the 80s, the sight on the news of British soldiers patrolling in a place that looked so familiar but felt so distant was a stalwart, a visual cue for a conflict I didn't then understand. It was a time when the word terrorist simply meant the IRA, and only the IRA. In the wake of Iraq and then Afghanistan, it is difficult to fully comprehend how dangerous operations in Northern Ireland truly were. We lost 178 service personnel over a decade on Operation Telic, including the invasion of Iraq and subsequent warfighting operations. We lost 170 service personnel on Operation Banner in 1972 alone. We must stand behind those who have served this nation and fought against terrorism. Post-service, the government must stand behind our armed forces to ensure protection, safety and support for all veterans. It is therefore a grave concern that this government did not support the Legacy and Reconciliation Act, as this would have shut down 38 legacy inquests. If this government goes the way that many fear that they will, they may get their legacy legislation catastrophically wrong. We could see those and more cases reopened with, to quote my right honourable friend, the member for Goole and Pocklington, at least 50 innocent veterans exposed to legal persecution for crimes that they did not commit. We simply cannot let this happen. I've had constituents who served in Northern Ireland contact me with their dismay of what they feel this government's attitude is towards them and those they served alongside. Veterans in my constituency and the country at large are at a loss to think that historic, often baseless cases might be opened, reopened and vexatiously pursued. This is causing unfathomable worries for many, some now at the end of their days. And where are the reassurances that the government's future legislation will protect rather than persecute veterans? This not only will have an impact on veterans, but I too am concerned about the impact on future retention and recruitment of our armed forces, if people feel that orders they give or action will be subject to public investigation in perpetuity. And I include those of us on both sides of this chamber who have served, who may well be brought into the scope of that. In conclusion, Ms Law, I urge the government to bring clarity to the minds of those who served in Operation Banner. I urge the government to not betray those who fought for this country and to congratulate rather than condemn their courageous restraint. I urge them to go about this in the right way and stand with our veterans, not play into the hands of those who wish to rewrite history, settle scores and drag our veterans through the mire.
Very good.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Dr Al Pinkerton.
Thank you, Ms Lewell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and I thank the honourable and right honourable members for their contributions to this important debate, and indeed to the 175,000 petitioners who have brought this issue into the public domain. I join others in paying tribute to our extraordinary armed forces who have fought and defended our freedoms. I think today about my grandfather, who, although was too young to serve in Northern Ireland, knew precisely what was meant by fighting against terrorism, placed as he was in mandatory Palestine shortly after the Second World War, dodging the bombs and bullets of the Leahy and the Haganah, and narrowly avoided being blown up in the King David Hotel. I open with a statement that should be entirely self-evident. Families bereaved by the Troubles deserve clear, credible answers and access to justice. This is not about ideology or party politics. It's about the foundational principles of decency, dignity and the right to truth, something that many victims' families in Northern Ireland and beyond have waited decades for. The Troubles, Legacy and Reconciliation Act 2023, the Legacy Act, sadly fell short of that aim and those principles. By shutting down investigations and offering conditional immunity, it extinguished the remaining legal pathways for families across Northern Ireland's political spectrum. It told victims that time had run out on reconciliation, a key tenet of which is legal accountability. Tellingly, every major Northern Ireland political party, victims groups and others opposed the legislation, albeit at times for vastly different reasons. And yet, I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and for giving me an opportunity to place on record my thanks to the veterans and the service people in my Taunton Wellington constituency, including 40 Commando and the 412 who signed the petition. Would my honourable friend agree that the problem for the government, and I'm a man who is willing to believe we should be approaching this on a cross-party basis, we should be trying to seek a solution which protects our veterans across party lines, isn't a challenge for the government to convince veterans that their interest will be looked after before announcing a repeal of the Legacy Act?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think the issue that my honourable friend puts his finger on is the issue of trust and the lack of trust in multiple constituencies who have interest in this question, and that applies to communities in Northern Ireland as much as it does veterans. And I hope that what this government does in pursuing a repeal and replace will be at the very least to try and rebuild trust in this process. Yet the Legacy Act passed, leaving families in limbo irrespective of their religious or cultural identity. Now, while we recognise on these benches the legal necessity to repeal and replace the Act, I have serious doubt about the government's commitment to meaningful consultation with those it should be listening to most clearly. On visits to Northern Ireland with the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, I've spoken to survivors and families from across Northern Ireland's communities. Victims made it clear to me that they do not seek prosecutions. What they want is honest, truthful information about how and why their loved ones died. If the government is serious about progress, it must act swiftly to restore faith in the investigatory process that has been diminished by the creation of the ICRIR as a product of the Legacy Act. The Liberal Democrats support the creation of a new ECHR-compliant independent information retrieval body established in consultation with victims and survivors. That includes meaningful participation from next of kin, as proposed by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. It should have statutory powers to compel disclosure, backed by robust oversight. Victims must have access to records with exemptions limited to tightly defined national security grounds. Done properly, such a body could deliver long-awaited answers, support societal reconciliation, and offer some reassurance to British veterans by establishing the truth without the perceived necessity of pursuing a prosecutorial pathway. But that will only be possible with genuine cross-border cooperation between the PSNI, the UK Government, the Northern Ireland Executive, and importantly, the Irish Government, who have been remarkably reluctant to participate in processes up till now. All stakeholders must contribute to a clear, credible record of the past. Let me directly now address the concerns about and from British Armed Forces veterans. If the rule of law is to mean anything in this country, its application must be fair and equal for everyone across all parts of the United Kingdom. The UK Armed Forces proudly operate within the law, and that is instilled from day one of training for officers and soldiers alike. We do no honour to their service by weakening or suspending the legal standards under which they serve. Supporting our forces means applying the law fairly, not shielding wrongdoing, not applying unequal scrutiny. Now, many paramilitary actions were never formally recorded and now depend on memory. British forces, by contrast, left extensive records, making them more visible and sometimes more vulnerable to investigation. That imbalance has created the perception of unfairness and injustice. Between 1998 and 2022, 6 members of the UK Armed Forces were charged with Troubles-related offences, out of over 250,000 who served during Operation Banner. That is 0.0003% of the serving population. I will.
It's not just about the final prosecution, it's what they have to go through for all their years. Will the members say how many people have actually had the knock at the door, the call, or had to give evidence? Because that's what's really hurting people.
Well, I wasn't, but I will endeavour to do so. And I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, because what he puts his finger on isn't just the numbers, and I was going to make this point. It's about the experience that those veterans have. And if I may, just in conclusion, I absolutely recognise the deep anxiety felt by many veterans. That concern, that fear, must not and should not be diminished or dismissed, but nor should it be unjustifiably stoked for political ends. If the government is serious about restoring confidence, it must listen to victims, veterans and legal experts. And in the last few days before announcing what I think is going to be new legislation, can I perhaps just pose a couple of questions to the Secretary of State? What steps is he taking to ensure that any new legacy framework is ECHR compliant? And following this turbulent hiatus, how will he ensure that our armed forces veterans are protected from the most vexatious of legal actions, and to ensure that the investigation doesn't become the punishment?
Opposition spokesperson Mark Francois.
Thank you, Ms Stolbach. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon as we debate this critical petition. With over 176,000 signatures, some 6,000 of which have been added today. May I also commend the honourable member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk, who introduced the debate so very ably. It's also a privilege to have in the public gallery this afternoon some 30 veterans who served their country bravely in Northern Ireland, even including 5 from the Royal Hospital at Chelsea. For obvious reasons, these veterans have a very strong interest in our proceedings today, and may I begin by saying to them, and all those who served alongside them, thank you for your service. For context, some 300,000 British soldiers served on what became known as Operation Banner, the British Army's mission to uphold the rule of law in Northern Ireland. Of those, well over 700 were murdered, and thousands more suffered life-changing injuries at the hands of both Republican and so-called loyalist terrorists. If you include the UDR and the RUCGC, as the leader of the DUP rightfully said, the total comes to over 1,400 dead. The last Conservative government introduced the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Act 2023 to try and assist the community in Northern Ireland to move on from the difficult history of the Troubles, and also to provide protection for many of those veterans from an endless cycle of investigation and reinvestigation, often inspired by Sinn Féin. The Labour Party's election manifesto stated their intention to repeal this Act in favour of new legislation, although no such legislation has been forthcoming, even in draft form. Labour have even sought to claim that the Legacy Act somehow protected alleged IRA terrorists from prosecution, when it was the Blair government that famously handed hundreds of such men letters of comfort so that effectively they could not be prosecuted anyway. And even if they were, they would now only get a maximum of 2 years, even for murder, as brilliantly pointed out by my right honourable friend from the New Forest. However, pending new legislation, the government has produced a so-called remedial order under the auspices of the Human Rights Act 1998. By this method, it is seeking to remove some provisions of the Legacy Act, which it states have been found in the lower courts to be incompatible with the Human Rights Act 1998, even though the incoming government could have appealed to the UK Supreme Court, but seemingly, deliberately, did not. The net effect of this remedial order is twofold. Firstly, it would allow the conveyor belt of coronial inquests in Northern Ireland to resume, a number of which have subsequently led to verdicts against the soldiers, for instance, at Clonno, as brilliantly highlighted by my right honourable friend, the member for Goole and Pocklington, in his very moving speech. In addition, the remedial order would also remove the clauses in the Legacy Act which currently prevent Gerry Adams and several hundred of his associates from attempting to sue the British government and thus the taxpayer for compensation. At Prime Minister's questions on the 15th of January, the Prime Minister faithfully promised, and I quote him, "We are working on a draft remedial order and replacement legislation, and we will look at every conceivable way to prevent these types of cases from claiming damages. It is important that I say that on the record." Well, nevertheless, the remedial order, as pushed through the Joint Committee on Human Rights, with Labour and I'm sad to say Liberal votes, barely a month later, remained unchanged, and it still does. These proposals have evoked considerable concern, not least from the Royal British Legion, who have stated, and I quote their briefing note, "The Royal British Legion calls for the government to urgently provide clarity on their intent regarding the process of legacy prosecution. We believe that the anxiety and uncertainty created by the current situation is unfair and is having a substantial negative impact on veterans and their families. While I obviously cannot speak for the Royal British Legion, having met them recently, were the government to proceed with this ill-advised course, so obviously injurious to veterans, I cannot foresee the Legion standing idly by. Moreover, the 3 Veterans Commissioners for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland respectively, who are neither ill-informed nor naive, recently issued a powerful joint statement which said, I quote, "We stand united in our firm support of the motion to be debated in Westminster on the 14th of July. We are deeply concerned by the prospect of retrospective legal action being taken against veterans who are carrying out their lawful duties, often under immense pressure and threat." Incidentally, the government has been foot-dragging for months on its absolute promise to create an English Veterans Commissioner. And now we know why. Indeed, we now understand that the British government has been negotiating some form of sordid backstairs deal with their counterparts in the Irish Republic, part of which, we fear, will lead to further attempted prosecution of veterans while assisting Gerry Adams in return. This government-sanctioned form of lawfare is self-evidently a case of two-tier justice at its worst, and that is why on these benches we are utterly against it. Therefore, when the Secretary of State replies, could he please provide absolute clarity on whether or not the government still intend to proceed with a remedial order, which would then likely result in a high-stakes vote this autumn, or whether it is now their intent to go straight to primary legislation instead. Our veterans, who unlike the provisionals, never received letters of comfort from the Blair government, and many of whom now effectively have a sword of Damocles hanging over them yet again, deserve a straight answer from the Secretary of State this afternoon. In addition to the powerful moral argument as made by many of my honourable friends today, and others, there's also the potential adverse effect on both recruitment and retention of this misguided policy. No. Who would wish to serve a government later? Who would wish to serve a government who may ask them to risk their life fighting for the state, only to then be prosecuted in a courtroom half a century later? As General the Lord Dannatt, a former highly respected Chief of the General Staff, put it so well, and I quote him, "Why would any sensible young person think of putting on the Queen's uniform if they thought they could be tapped on the shoulder years after an operation and questioned over false allegations?" The Secretary of State will already be aware from his colleagues in the MOD, some of whom have a distinguished Special Forces background, that this process is having an adverse effect on morale within the Special Forces community, and indeed in the Army more widely. It will be an act of sheer folly and indeed aid to our enemies to continue to proceed with this act of military self-harm so that, put bluntly, even fewer people will join the Army and even more will leave. This is therefore not just morally but also operationally mad and a gift to our adversaries to boot. I'll give way briefly. Briefly.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He talks about recruitment. Does he recognise that 14 years of Conservatives have wrecked our armed forces, and what the Labour government is doing to invest in our armed forces and invest in their housing has led to an increase in recruitment because new people recognise how important this is?
I'll answer him on recruitment. If it hadn't been from the brave men sitting at the back, there would be no Good Friday Agreement in the first place. Yeah. Thank God they joined up and had the courage to serve. So I say to the Secretary of State this afternoon, in all candour, what you are doing is wrong. Many of the soldiers who served bravely in Northern Ireland were recruited from so-called red wall seats, from Blackburn to Bury and Bolton to Burnley, and served in proud regiments in Northern Ireland to uphold the rule of law. Surely the Secretary of State is not going to try and dragoon Labour MPs through the division lobbies to throw veterans to the wolves whilst doing Jerry Adams a favour. The events of the last fortnight show Labour backbenchers can no longer be taken for granted, and surely not over this. How can they possibly go back to their constituencies and look those local veterans and their descendants in the eye if they voted for such a pernicious proposal? Perhaps I could conclude with a poem from Rudyard Kipling, who wrote one called Tommy, about the ordinary British soldier and the ingratitude of his country after he had fought for it in war. Perhaps the Secretary of State will recognise the final stanza. For it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and chuck him out, the brute. But he's saviour of his country when the guns begin to shoot. And it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and anything you please. And Tommy ain't a bloomin' fool. You bet that Tommy sees. Secretary of State, these brave men fought against the IRA, one of the most ruthless and vicious terrorist organisations the world has ever seen. They did their duty to their country. They defended us. Do not aid and abet their former mortal enemy. Let these brave men live out their lives in peace.
Yeah. Secretary of State.
It is a pleasure to serve, Ms Lord, under your chairship. I'm very grateful to the organisers of the petition, to the Honourable Member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk for his opening remarks, and to all the members who have spoken. Now, I will try in the very short time I have to answer as many of the points as possible that have been made. But I want to say at the outset that I recognise the very real fears that many veterans have, and especially those who've been called to give evidence a number of times. I've heard that in the meetings I've had with veterans, and the government takes those concerns very seriously. A number of things are very clear from the debate that we have had. The first is, and I join the opposition spokesperson, we are of course united in our appreciation of the extraordinary service of our brave armed forces, police, security services and others, who serve with distinction in the most difficult circumstances, described chillingly by the Honourable Member for Spelthorne in his contribution, during the Troubles to keep the people of Northern Ireland safe. And we will forever be in their debt, including our debt to all the veterans in the hall today and the members in this hall who have served in our armed forces. We all agree there can be no rewriting of history, and I agree with the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green that there is, of course, no equivalence between soldiers and terrorists. I would just say to him, however, the Independent Commission on the Location of Victims' Remains, he mentioned Robert Nairac, was not created by the Legacy Act, was created by a treaty reached between the United Kingdom and the Irish government. In 1999, it has recovered a number of the remains of those taken, murdered and buried by the IRA, but sadly not yet the remains of Robert Nairac. But I also want to say this. We can't have any more false promises or undeliverable pledges, pledges that our courts have found to be unlawful. And that is why we will fix the mess we inherited from the previous government, whatever its intentions were, and we will protect our veterans as we do so. Now, on inquests, we all understand, I understand, why the Clonoe inquest has caused such consternation and, frankly, incredulity. It was an operation in which an armed IRA gang, which had just tried to kill members of the RUC, were confronted by British soldiers. The government is clear that the findings did not reflect the context in which the incident took place, and that's why we have got the backs of the veterans involved by seeking a judicial review to try and protect them. The MOD is also funding the veterans to bring their own JR. But not all Northern Ireland inquests end like this. Other inquests have found that the use of lethal force by our military was justified, including in 2 inquest verdicts delivered last year. The truth is that our legal system is independent. Why is it independent? Because we all believe in the rule of law. And I would just say to the honourable member who opened the debate, if I heard him correctly, he did talk about politically motivated charges. I presume he is talking about criminal charges. All I would say to him, in all gentleness, is if he is claiming that there are politically motivated charges, he is saying that the Director of Public Prosecutions in Northern Ireland is politically motivated. I utterly reject that, and I hope all members will reject that too. And let us look at the facts. I will give way once, yes.
I agree with him. He described the situation in law as illegal, but he never pressed the question of the appeal to the Supreme Court, which would have decided the question of whether it was in fact illegal. Was that a decision taken on the basis of law, and if so, what were the grounds for it?
I didn't say it was illegal. I said it was unlawful, and I shall come very, very directly to the point that the right honourable gentleman raises. Look at the facts. Of the 250,000 veterans who served so bravely in Operation Banner, as we heard, the number who have been prosecuted for offences has been very, very small. The Centre for Military Justice records that only 1 soldier has been convicted since the Good Friday Agreement. And the House might just want to reflect on that, because for almost all of those 27 years, immunity was not on the statute book. The Legacy Act wasn't passed. If the right honourable member will bear with me, 27 years. We have also heard it said, on the other hand, that terrorists are not being prosecuted and somehow they've been given immunity. And I do want to challenge that, both because the only thing that gave terrorists immunity was the Legacy Act, and also because during the Troubles, an estimated 25 to 35,000 Republicans and Loyalists were tried and convicted, many of them serving sentences for murder and bombings. Indeed, there have been 5 convictions for terrorist-related offences connected to the Troubles since 2012. And on the so-called on-the-run letters, they had no legal force, and those letters did not give anyone any immunity. On interim custody orders, I have made it clear in a written answer a couple of weeks ago, we will bring forward legislation to deal with that. And I would say to the spokesperson for the opposition, by the way, the remedial order does not bring back inquests. He needs to read the draft. He was incorrect when he suggested that. And the fact that the Legacy Act enabled terrorists to be given immunity was, as we've heard, one of the principal reasons why so many people in Northern Ireland were strongly opposed to it. And we do need to have in mind the people of Northern Ireland when we discuss these matters, including all of the political parties, many, many victims and survivors, and I've met many of them myself, and some Northern Ireland veterans group with whom I met last year. There is not one view on this. Now, I know that there are some, and we've heard the argument in the debate today, who say there should be absolute immunity for anyone who served in Operation Banner. But I would simply say to them that as a country, we either believe in the rule of law. Well, I have that there should be no prosecutions. We either believe in the rule of law or we do not, a point forcefully made by my honourable friends, the members for North East Derbyshire and Hales Owen. And as the former Conservative Defence Secretary Ben Wallace put it, the British Army is not above the law, nor should it be. That is the difference between us and the terrorists. And in a joint statement last Friday, the Veterans Commissions for Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales said they do not call, and I quote, for immunity from the law. They're not calling for immunity from the law, but for fairness under it. I could not agree with them more. Now, because immunity was struck down by the domestic courts, even before the government was elected, and we came into office committed, indeed, to repeal the Act, any incoming administration would have had to fix it. And it is wrong for anyone to suggest anything different. But the truth is, because we don't agree with it, is the answer. But legacy is... Oh,
Could members please refrain from shouting out and having dialogue with the Secretary of State and do interventions in the normal manner, please?
Legacy is hard. This is the unfinished business of the Good Friday Agreement. And that is why, I'm afraid because of the time, I'm not able to. And that is why, as well as listening carefully to veterans, which we are doing, we also need to listen to the many families who lost loved ones, including the families of British service personnel who served so bravely. There are more than 200 families of UK military personnel who are still searching for answers 30, 40, 50 years ago about the murder of their loved ones. The Police Service of Northern Ireland recently confirmed on the 31st of April last year they had 202 live investigations into troubles-related killings of members of our armed forces and a further 23 into the killings of veterans. The following day, on the 1st of May, each and every one of those investigations was forced to close by the Legacy Act. And the other challenge, no, I'm not going to give way, and the other challenge which all of us have to face is the lack of confidence in the Act on the part of communities in Northern Ireland and the Commission it created, which we are going to seek to reform. So it is more capable of commanding confidence for those who are searching for answers. So we owe it to all these families, and the Honourable Member for Surrey Heath reminded us to remember them and reminded us of their search for answers. We owe it to them, to all communities, to get this right, and including trying to reach an agreement with the Irish government, because doing nothing is not credible.
Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.